Welcome to 21st Century Saints, our podcast and live stream series for members, those affiliated with, those adjacent to, or those who have an interest in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints here in the United Kingdom and around the world. It is great to be back after our break. We are so thankful for all of you who have expressed love and concern while Alana and I have been sick. Alana's had a family bereavement, and we send our love to you, dear friend, and we're all thinking of you. But it's so good to be here. I also have to shout out to the incredible people who have made donations to us. What a kind thing to do, to be able to support us in our work. So thank you so much for doing that. We really do appreciate it, and we really do put it to good use. Okay, as you guys can see, we're broadcasting earlier than the advertised time because I am not so good with the time difference. I feel like we're colonists here in the UK, right? Everyone should be on UK time. I don't know. But in my head, everyone is working to my schedule. So we're here, we're early. And if you are able to join us now or catch up, it is great to have you here. What else do I have to tell you about? Like and subscribe would also be a really great thing and will help us in the work that we are doing. Now, as you guys know who've been following this journey for the past few months, a lot of our focus has been on the subject of topics related to abuse and all of the sort of things related to abuse in the context of Mormonism, and specifically in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And we've had so many amazing conversations. So many of you have reached out to us, and we just want to honor the fact that you have felt that you can share your story with us. We stand with you and we believe you. To Dana and Katie, who have shared their story, we hold you in such honor, and we are so thankful for your vulnerability. You have helped others find their voices, and you continue to do so. So those are the big shout outs I wanted to do before we get started. This is a heavy subject. Rightly so, because we're talking about really, really big things. And for that reason, tonight, Alana is taking some time. We have hopefully the wonderful Sarah is in the comments, and we should be able to see, yeah, Sarah's in the comments. Hey, our angel. Sarah's helping us moderate. And is continuing to fulfill that role for us, and will continue to work with us as a part of the Brit Vendors group. So if you do want to access any resources or support about the things that we're talking about tonight, we do have the wonderful Sarah in the chat who's able to help signpost you, and we will put some links in the show notes. With this being such a heavy subject, and having had COVID myself, I have had a few little moments of my own. So I think we've gotten back. I've had a few little moments of my own, just, as we process this. Self-care is really important, and it's led to me literally cutting all of my hair off. I knew it had to happen. Yeah, so people, watch out for your watch out for your friends. If you are feeling triggered by anything, you contact your doctor, contact your therapist, reach out to friends. You can reach out to us here. And we're with you. We would really encourage you to do that. And of course, tonight, if this subject is not for you right now, then take a break, come back to it, and look after yourselves. Okay, with all of that having been done, as you guys can see, we have a guest with us, and this is a guest who we have wanted to interview from the very early days of doing the podcast. In fact, even before we started doing the podcast, Alana, this has been Alana's most important subject. This has been Alana's closest to her heart. So we have the wonderful, as Peter Bleakley refers to him, His Holiness Sam Young is in the studio. Sam, would you like to say hi to our audience?
Well, I didn't know that we were going to have an audience, a live audience. Well, how fun is that?
Did
Or
I forget to tell you?
to millions of people who are tuned in to this, to this wonderful podcast, 21st Century Saints. How cool is that? So, greetings.
So we are hoping that we're also going to have Peter Bleakley join us, because there's actually some pretty cool things I wanted to bring in and share with you all when we get to that wonderful moment. And plus, we love Peter. We miss Peter, and we can find out what he's up to too. Okay, we're going to start this conversation with, I guess, the background of the United Kingdom. And so many people actually still don't know who Sam is, because we haven't moved into that space here yet, or because pretty much in the UK we've been very isolated a lot of the time for what's happening within the broader world of Mormonism. So we're going to go back and talk about why you should know Sam Young, why everyone should know who Sam Young is, and what his work is. But also we're going to talk a little bit about how you got to the point before you became this huge name in Mormonism. So you were raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, right? Would you tell us a little bit about your background?
What? I was
About,
raised.
yeah, your Mormon pedigree.
You realize I was baptized Episcopalian.
I did not.
Yeah, so I'm Episcopalian. I'm still
Okay.
Episcopalian. I'm not Mormon anymore, but I'm still Episcopalian. I was baptized when I was a baby in the Episcopalian church. My father had not converted yet. He converted shortly after that. My mother had been Mormon her entire life, but when they got married, she wasn't terribly active. But yes, I was basically raised. I don't remember that baptism. I remember my baptism at 8 in the Mormon church. And so, yes, I was raised in the church in Utah,
You know, it's
near Salt Lake.
funny. I was an infant baptized into. I can't even remember. But it doesn't really occur to me to remember that that's part of my story too. Funnily enough, so you are part of a convert family. How'd you like the church? Was it home? What were you a
Oh,
good
I love the
kid?
church. I love the
Mhm.
church. First of all, it was 100% true. It was the only true and living church upon the face of the earth. All the other churches were abominations. But anyway, I love the church. I had a great experience in the church.
Did you serve a mission?
I did, which I still cherish the mission. Uh, Served in Guatemala and El Salvador. So I got to learn Spanish. I can still speak a few words. Una, dos, tres. Um, I'm pretty good with Spanish, but it was a great experience. I loved the mission. I, met all the traditional benchmarks of a Mormon male. The priesthood steps, the mission, going to the temple, getting married in the temple, serving in a ton of callings, including I served as a bishop for over 5 years. On the
Did
side
you?
council numerous times and so on.
Uh-huh. Did you have particular things that you really loved about being Mormon? Like we're saying, the only true church on the earth. Were there doctrines or things about the church that you particularly loved that you would highlight when you were, really in?
Okay, so they're, you go through stages in life. As a kid, I loved scouts. Uh, I loved going to church and meeting with the boys. I wasn't very outgoing, so I was kind of the quiet guy, but still, I loved being around the guys. Loved the scouting. Uh, when I got older, oh man, I loved the girls. So you got all these dances you go to, and the girls come from different wards and different stakes. So I loved that interaction. Um, like I mentioned, the mission was great. So, and then once I got a little older, once I got out of, I think I had this proclivity most of my life. I kind of was drawn to those that are on the margins. My wife, when we were dating, I was the single adult chairman for our stake, and we would have dances regularly, single adult dances. And my wife kind of complained at some point in time because we would go to the dances and I would dance with her once or twice, but I dance every dance because I'm dancing with all the girls that are not dancing. I'm going to be dancing with all those girls to make sure. And so I had a lot of female friends as an adult before I got married. She now cherishes that, memory that I would take her to a dance and hardly ever dance with her. But I enjoyed the opportunity to serve in the church, particularly those that sat on the margins. When I went to church, I loved being the greeter. Well, I wasn't the greeter, but I'd stand at the door just to greet people, and especially those people that are going to be sitting by themselves. I wanted to go out. So anyway, I enjoyed the opportunity to serve people in the church a lot.
Did you, and obviously this will be more relevant later on, but did you have any particular affinity with the families can be together forever doctrine? And before you answer that, what I'm going to do is bring in Peter, just so that you can all get used to his face. We also have Peter here in the studio. Hey, Peter.
Yay, Peter!
Hello. Can you
You
hear me?
doing, my friend?
Can I just let you all know, most of us in the Brit Avengers have kind of been on the night shift. So last night, our wonderful priesthood dispatches spent the whole night in a haunted hotel, just to do a video for us. And, so you guys are all going to get to see that pretty soon. But we were on standby because it was terrifying, and we did the what would it have been? I was on the phone with him at maybe 3:30 a.m. and just spending the whole night making sure that he didn't get dragged down to the pits by demons. So yeah, we're all we're all exhausted. But back to you, Sam. Tell me, what were your feelings about was the doctrine of eternal families particularly appealing to you?
Oh yes, I love that doctrine, of course. And I loved another doctrine that Peter loved and maybe still loves, that we were on an eternal progression path, that we could become just like God with all of his powers and authority and so on. By the way, I want to say this. So Jane, it's a super pleasure to be with you. It's almost as great a pleasure to have Peter on board. No, this is a great pleasure. I don't know if we have not had much individual interaction.
No.
But I feel like, tears are coming to my eyes a little bit. I feel like you're a best friend from all the interactions from the early days of me, kind of working through a transition. So it's just great to see you here. Great to have you here.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I'm meeting one of my heroes.
Well, hey, look, that goes both ways. I'm meeting one of my heroes too.
And I'm excited to help the audience to kind of see how that's come about. This is because this was huge in the UK. This was so huge. So here we are, this island who is fairly insulated against I mean, lots of people didn't know about John Dehlin, Mormon Stories podcast. The Kate Kelly stuff had kind of been happening, but I think for the most part, there wasn't a huge amount of awareness about what's going on in the Mormon blogosphere or world. So we're quite isolated. And there's you, this wonderful, and one of the reasons that I fell in love with your work is you as a Mormon bishop, ex-bishop who had served, who was currently a Mormon, was so excited about the church and clearly loved the church so much. But something happened. You had a concern that was so big it changed the course of the whole of Mormonism. So can I take you back to the conversation that you have with your daughter?
Okay, so I'm going to give you a little background on that conversation.
Please do.
The question I asked her was, honey, did the bishop ever ask you if you masturbated? You need a little background, because until I said that word, I had never pronounced that word in my house the whole time my kids were growing up. We'd never talked about that. I'd never really thought to talk about it. I may not even known that girls could masturbate. Okay. I probably didn't know that. But it's just not something I'd ever thought about. So, but here's the way that conversation came about. Started to have some questions about the church. And so I was exploring those questions, and someone had, a friend of mine that I'd home taught for 10 years, one day gave me a call because he saw I was questioning stuff, and I was open about my questions. I was blogging about it. I was putting it on Facebook. So people were aware that I had questions and trying to work through them. So this fellow gave me a call and said, Sam, I think it's time that I tell you why I've never been to church. Home taught him for 10 years. He'd never come to church. We developed a bond of friendship. But I'd never asked him, hey, why aren't you coming to church, my friend? So I went over. We sat down on his porch. I think he had a cup of coffee. Now, I wasn't drinking coffee yet, so he was inactive, but he wanted to tell me why he'd quit coming to church. And he said, and his sons had grown up in the same ward with I've got 6 daughters, so he'd grown up in the same ward as 2 of my daughters, the youngest daughters. He said, Sam, one day my son, he had decided to go back to church when his kids reached teenage years, to have them taught moral principles and so on. But one day his youngest son, who was 14 at the time, said, Dad, the bishop just asked to meet with me. I'm a little nervous about that. So his dad said, don't worry about that. There's no problem with that, but I'll come sit on the couch outside the bishop's office. And if there's any problems, you just come out. I'll be right there. Meeting starts. Within a few minutes, his son rushed out, very upset, very agitated, said, Dad, the bishop just asked me if I masturbate and if I've ever had sex with boys. His dad, okay, now this guy is super intimidating. He's a big guy, former police officer, Vietnam vet, in the Vietnam War. He didn't wear a uniform most of the time. He was in the jungles of the country behind enemy lines. So he just has this amazing experience, but he comes across as very intimidating. And he said, Sam, I walked into that bishop's office. I leaned over the desk and I told him, if you ever ask my children a question like that again, I will beat you to a pulp. Mr. Intimidation is telling the bishop that. Well, rather than risk his children being asked questions like that again, he just quit coming to church. Now, I put that on the Facebook. Is this a common practice of bishops asking if you masturbate? You see, I've been a bishop for 5 years. I'd never asked that question. Nobody told me to ask that question. I thought, what man that's a bishop would ever have a thought suddenly appear in his mind? Ooh, ask that girl if she masturbates. Or that boy if he masturbates. The thought was never, ever there. I was raised in the church. I was never asked any explicit questions by my bishops. So I didn't know if it was a common practice. I asked the question on Facebook, and I was flooded with responses. And so many of the responses, and then I got a ton of personal messages telling me their stories. And it was just horrendous what people were being asked and how they were harmed. So I had this happen for a couple months, had all this stuff coming in, and I started blogging about it. And then it finally dawned on me, well, you know what? My daughter is this kid's age, the same bishop. So that's why I posed that question to her, if she was ever asked by the bishop if she masturbated.
And she responded by telling you that had happened, that he had asked that question?
Yep. She said, yeah, Dad, he did. And I didn't know what it was. So I asked my friends. They didn't know what it was. So, Dad, I Googled it. I found what masturbation was. I found out how to do it. And I found pornography. So she was introduced to the pornography by her bishop, who was a good friend of mine. And I asked her, did he ever ask you that question again? She says, yes, Dad. The whole time I was a youth, I was asked that question many times. So I then asked, so did you ever lie about it? Well, of course, Dad, I did, just like everybody else. So there it is. I was stunned. Okay. Anger is one of my favorite emotions now because it is so motivating. It clears out all the obstacles in front of you that are scary. I'm feeling that same anger that I felt right then, that a bishop had my child in his office all alone and asked her a question that was totally inappropriate, and it harmed her. And I didn't even know about it until about 10 years later.
Wow. Most people would do what your friend did and either back away from church, realizing this is not the environment I want my child to be raised in, or would put it on their shelf and just live with the dissonance. You did more than that. You're blogging, you're talking about it on Facebook. What happened next? How come everybody started listening to you? What did you do?
Well, I thought this is a no-brainer, right? Most everybody in the world, except I don't know how many members of the church, but many members of the church feel that this is okay. But everybody outside of the church and many in the church feel like, oh my gosh, that is a super violation of a child's private space and can super damage them. So I thought it was a no-brainer, right? That, oh, come on, this is a no-brainer. We got to change this. So I went to talk to my bishop and stake president, and I'd already been meeting with them about questions I had in the church. And these are all my friends that I had a great community here in Houston that had been developed over 40 years of being in the church, being in church leadership. And anyway, they eventually told me, Sam, there's no problem with this. First of all, nobody's asking these questions. Really, how do you know the bishops aren't asking these questions? I know that a ton are. Anyway, they just said there's no problem. The final point was when I presented them a whole bunch of stories. And they looked at the stories and said, you know what? This is the stake president. I believe all those stories, but it's really not a problem. I'm thinking, first of all, you didn't read all these stories. You read these stories, you would be horrified, or at least normal people are horrified at this. So I tried to talk to my bishop and stake president, and I continued to do that for about 6 months after all this came out. But when I realized that they're not.
Oh, we've just lost Sam. I'm sure he'll be reconnecting in a second. Peter, do you want to share any thoughts while we try to get Sam back?
Sure, absolutely. We've lost Sam. What have we done, Jane? Well, just to mirror what you said, I think one of the things Sam is pointing to, and I was flabbergasted when he said, as a bishop, he'd never experienced being asked those questions, and it had never occurred to him to ask them. At first, I was a bit skeptical. It's like, you are absolutely kidding me, because this is something people talk about constantly. But he's absolutely spot on there. What he's pointing to is the fact that there are so many sort of different leadership roulette experiences within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Hi, Sam. We're just saying, I'm just sort of reiterating your point that, it's leadership roulette in the church. There are so many people who have completely different levels of normal. How intrusive questioning is going to be in worthiness interviews is one of them. And what you really highlighted for me, I think, is this idea that you have these almost subcultures and traditions based on what people have experienced in their own childhood and what leaders ask them about, and then they perpetuate when they're in leadership and never question it, because that's what they think everyone does. And that is an issue that hits on a load of other issues in the church, of people's individual cafeteria Mormonism. They assume everyone else in the church does it exactly like they do, and critical analysis and discussion and questioning things isn't really encouraged. So no one ever realizes like how wildly different people's experiences are in the church. And I think that was such a powerful thing for us to follow your discovery of this as an adult in the church, to sort of suddenly realize how different the experience of sexual shaming being inbuilt into the whole system can be for people. And so this is, this really lit a fire, because there are, one faction of people like Sam saying, well, this is nuts. Of course we don't do this. Why would anyone ask these questions of children? And then you've got a whole army of people who've had it completely normalized, saying, well, of course we have to ask these questions. It's the law of chastity. It's what we've always done. It's what we do. It's essential. Worthiness, worthiness, worthiness. You've got to check these things. And by worthiness, they never mean, are you grumpy with your sister? Or, have you been generous to the poor this week? It's all sexual, and we come in with these 6-monthly worthiness interviews. It's still the prescribed norm that between now the age of 11, because we're ordaining kids at 11 now if they're boys, and sending them to the temple. So girls get worthiness interviews for a temple recommend, 2 baptisms at the temple. We're interrogating them before they even started puberty in many cases, and front and center in the criteria and the things they're meant to be interrogated about is their sexual activities and thoughts. And that is the big one. That's the one everyone's focused on, obsessed with, paranoid about, talking about, usually very euphemistically. So the kids at first haven't a clue what's going on here. And you're inducted into this world of responsibility and worthiness interviews. And just like, at first you kind of don't know what's going on because it's all new to you. And often LDS parents are not so good at talking about sexuality anyway. They've got no script to work with from the church that's healthy or confident. And it can take you a long time to sort of clue up what's going on here and decide then whether to cooperate or rebel. I'll keep waffling. So I'm good.
Yeah, we've got Sam back, and when in the
Awesome.
moments when if you get booted, Sam, we will keep the conversation going until you're back with us. So we're good. Here's what here's what I wanted to ask you, Sam. I guess I wanted to give you a little bit of context. So obviously, around about the same time as you start speaking, and we've just lost him again. Around about the time that Sam had started speaking out loud, Peter, how well known would you say his work was in those very, very early days here in the UK? What was the impact it was having?
Oh, completely unheard of. Like nothing, tumbleweed. The only way anyone in Britain and most of the international church hears about anything going on is if it's in the official curriculum. if it's central, if you hear it in gospel in general conference, or it's in a manual or the ensign. Although I've got this motto now that if you want to hide something in plain sight, put it in the ensign. No one reads it anymore.
Yeah.
Now the Liahona, and that just we grew up in this sort of version of Mormonism that's kind of very pure. We just got this very filtered, idealistic religion from the missionaries, and we've been living it ever since and doing our thing. And we have no idea about the politics and power and the legislative power and the influence in the culture war in America that the church plays or tries to play and can play in the states where Mormons dominate, in Idaho and Utah, Arizona, bits of California. And the we're completely disconnected from all this. So the only way you'd ever hear about Sam, or there is this movement to challenge the church to be much more careful about safeguarding children, is if you're already plugged into the dissident internet, if you're in the Bloggernacle. So I first heard about this all through Mormon Stories podcast community, which has thousands of people in it. And there's a very fast, sort of rapid response, Reddit, Facebook, social media community to any developments and things happening. And Sam had already sort of, in a sense, raised his head above the parapet by voting opposed and going to General Conference to do so because of his concerns about some other things, before getting into particularly this issue of safeguarding children in the church. So he'd already shown his chops as someone willing to have integrity and passion and say, if something isn't right, we need to change it and do something about this. And then sort of this kicked off as Sam's just described, that this moment of kind of epiphany that all the time I was trusting this church for my children to be safe in, and behind my back, my daughters were being shamed about sexual behavior since their young teenage years. And
And
it's,
like you, Sam clearly loved. I'm going to say loves because we're going to talk about where he's at right now. But this was a man who loves the church, who loves the gospel as it's taught in the church, and this mattered. This wasn't sort of a takedown of the church. This was him really shining a light on what was happening, and the response to that from a lot of quarters was just relief that someone is listening. I think it's really interesting that first of all, he's creating this space, he's asking this question, which as soon as you ask a question, you're giving people, and it's not a loaded question like we get in the church manuals. Here is the question, but there is a very specific correct answer we want you to give. You're giving people the permission to really share what it is they're experiencing. And I just sort of, see that as a bit of a parallel with you, here is someone who really loves the church, who's trying to make things better.
Yes, yeah, very much. And he was always very careful to say this isn't a rebellion against the church, against the gospel, or anything like that at all. It's simply saying all these other churches and organizations have careful safeguarding of children. They don't do worthiness interviews of children. They just don't do it. And for me, that was just such an epiphany. When you grow up in the church, you're so used to all these things being the ordinary way to behave. Something Sam kept saying was, no one else does this. I would kind of push back a bit that the Roman Catholics do have a tradition of confession, of young people, but it's very much initiated by those young people mostly. They can go to confession if they choose, but they're not going to come out with a certificate or something, or be denied participation in stuff because of the outcome of that conversation. It's kept very private. And that's not healthy. Plenty of Roman Catholics sort of talk about how much they've been messed up around sexuality by some of the shaming that's intrinsic there. So it's not just our church that has these issues.
Absolutely.
But it was, I think Sam, the genius was just saying, hang on a minute, this isn't right.
We've lost him again.
He looks good though. I'll speak for him.
I feel so bad. I know that
isn't it?
Our friend Katie is in the chat. Maybe maybe you might be able to reach out and give Sam a little bit of advice. I'm guessing it's maybe an internet stability issue. Okay.
Okay, right.
Right, he's going to try something else to get back out. We are going to work on this. We are going to hear from Sam. Yeah, this is all going to be good. Okay, Peter. Then why is it a big deal? Okay, because most church members who are here in the UK hearing about what's being said, so wanting to forget the changes that have been made, but at that time, who feel so confident in their bishops and stake presidents and youth leaders, isn't it valid to have those, those kinds of questions? Is there any place at all for a question like that?
Well, it's because it's seen as questioning the church, whatever that means, i.e. the leaders or how we do things. You're immediately seen as a traitor. You can't criticize anything without your testimony being questioned, your faithfulness. We become so uptight about carefully tone policing and thought policing each other that any kind of questioning of how things are, and particularly again, I think in Britain, we've grown up with this really naive, total trust in the leaders that they absolutely know what's doing. The church is just this amazing, golden, wonderful thing that can't do any wrong and wouldn't do any wrong. That we do offer up our children into these situations without even questioning that, hang on a minute, these men have no police background checks or training whatsoever in the things they're talking about. And we've just grown up with the idea that this is a badge of honor, that we're amateurs, not like those corrupt professional Christians with their trained clergy, with their degrees and counseling skills. Somehow we're more pure and the Holy Spirit will guide the bishop and they will never do anything wrong. But then I think you've also got, however, a lot of lived experience with people in experiencing completely appalling behavior by local leaders or by local members and then covered up by local leaders. I grew up with an aunt who was radicalized in her criticism of the church after being close to some situations of cover-ups of child abuse in the LDS church in her area. Every stake has got its dark secrets when you start to scratch the surface and introduce it as a topic of conversation. And then you've got the private shame of all the young people who've been fed into that system and been made to feel guilty just for being alive and having normal sexual feelings about anything whatsoever. But all of that being piled on with baggage of shame of any sexual sin is second only to murder in the For the Strength of Youth booklet that all the teenagers are given and still given as the guide for what the law of chastity even means. So what Sam tapped into was a huge well of pain and fear and guilt and secret shame. And he just said suddenly, hang on a minute, why on earth are we doing this? It's not right. Objectively, not as a criticism of the religion, just as a practice, as a way we interpret our ideas about worthiness and so on. It's not necessary, it's intrusive, it's harmful. And at the same time, we're experiencing the tipping point of a crash that 80% of our young people were leaving at the time. It's probably got worse since, but the church's own later leaked statistics. And then further research found they usually leave in their early teens, and that's the moment these interviews begin. So he was actually he was touching on a really key point about why we're losing people. I mean, this is carnage. We've spent years investing in our children, guiding them through primary, loving them, serving them, giving them community. And then we turn on them. The second they turn into puberty, suddenly they're the enemy, they're the danger, they can't trust themselves, they can't be trusted. We must carefully police every thought they have without offering them a healthy way to be sexual beings or experience adult sexuality, and teenage sexuality. So I think the thing about Sam is it's not about Sam, as he's always said.
Yeah.
He is speaking for thousands of people. You're speaking for thousands of people, Sam, So it's a shared experience, and that's why the movement grew so quickly, because it just resonated with an incredible need for the institution to reform and for individuals to be validated, to have their concern and pain actually understood and listened to, and to stop doing it to the next generation, which was, Sam's horror about this happening to his own children.
So
So I think that's why it kicked off. Yeah.
Yeah, let me jump in then with a question then to Sam. And thank you so much for trying so hard to get back to us. I really appreciate the time that you're giving us.
Well, now I'm in my car. Something wasn't working in the office, and
That's like he's in a spaceship somewhere.
Yeah. Hey, and thanks, Peter, for everything you said that I didn't hear.
We were just sort of generalizing about the subject.
It's all positive.
What I wanted to ask you, Sam, was okay, you came on my radar as with this excellent work you're doing. You're clearly what I'm going to call a trusted source, because you're someone who has those credentials. You start kind of John DeLynn starts to amplify what you're doing, and word about your work starts to get out. But I start to feel really annoyed. I start to feel really annoyed at Sam, because back in the day, Sam is not the first person to have raised this. Sam is not the first person to have spoken about this subject at all, and within the Latter-day Saint context. But Sam had people listening, which was wonderful. But why hadn't they listened before? Why hadn't they listened to the women who had been flagging this for years? So, it was a temporary feeling. But Sam, what are your thoughts on that? About why were people listening to you?
Well, first of all, I wish they had listened to the people that came before me. When I started doing this, I didn't even know anybody had raised the issue.
Right.
But they obviously had, and good for them. But people listening took a while for that to happen. So when I was blogging, when I was Facebooking, it started to get noticed. But I'm looking at it's got to be noticed a lot more than this to gain traction. So I started a petition. Now, people told me when I started the petition, well, that's not going to do anything. People have done petitions, and that's not going to yield anything. Well, the petition was slow to take off. So I started publishing it every place I could think of, and we gradually started getting traction. And the petition did a lot of good things for us. Obviously, and what I was told is, look, the church isn't going to listen to a petition, but people listen to the petition. So it got the message out. People were posting on the petition itself, their stories, making lots of comments. So that helped out a lot. Just doing the petitions. Why did people listen to me? Well, I think I stuck to it and didn't say it once or twice or three times, but I'm saying it every day for 6 months. Well, the petition, then I was actually contacted by a New York Times reporter. This would have been like in November, and we started the petition maybe in September or October. I think late September. And so he contacted me, and he contacted me because somebody reached out to the New York Times that had been following this. So great. Now, the New York Times, the guy asked some questions that I didn't have good answers to. Like he asked, do you have credentials that you are a bishop? Can you prove you're a bishop? Well, they give you a little card that you can carry around that you're a bishop. I couldn't find that card anywhere. And then he asked about the stories. Could he get access to the stories? We didn't have a good place. I could go to my blog, and I've listed some stories. Go to the petition, there are stories there, but it's cumbersome. So I started a website in December to start collecting stories. Well, that got a whole bunch of attention too, where people were now seeing this validates my story. I've not wanted to share this with anybody. I have been harmed this has been so traumatizing. It helped people see that they were not alone in what happened to them. So it started to gain more traction. And at some point I decided, and it's not, when I say I was doing most of the stuff, but I'm hearing suggestions from lots of people on what to do. What do you do next? Well, Kate Kelly, she had done a march. Other people, prominent people, accomplished great things, did marches. So we decided to take these stories that we'd gathered on the website, which I wish I'd had when the New York Times reporter called, because he never called back after I, didn't have the stuff he was looking for. But we then did the march. But I did started doing press conferences, and that gained a lot of traction too, because now it's in the on TV, it's in the paper when you do the press conference. And I was scared as all get out that first press conference that I did. But that's also something, it just started building as we did one thing after another. And this, none of this stuff was planned in advance. It was, well, let me start blogging. It's a no-brainer, and talk to my the church leaders, the local, regional church leaders. But I never planned anything. It was kind of, okay, so it's not moving yet. What do I do next? So I think part of it was I just stayed there and continued to do stuff.
Now, I really feel that there is more to the magic than that, and I think this is important because you continue to do this. I think, as our dear friend Alana points out in the comments, I think gender does come into it. The fact that it's women who had spoken up before, and haven't really had that platform that's allowed them to amplify the voices of others. If your concern has been the vulnerable and the marginalized as a church member, you then talked about how you opened your inbox and people were commenting, and just by asking that question, you've given people the space to share their stories. And when you are approaching your bishop and your stake president, you're taking those stories with you. The idea that you were, this wasn't just about your idea and your knowledge that there is something very, very wrong happening here. It was all about those stories, and continues to be. And that's what I think is really wonderful about your work, is you've used your social capital, you've used your platform, and been able to amplify the voices of others. And that still is what I have seen. That's still your approach today. I find it fascinating and wonderful, and I'd love to see that replicated throughout the church where we can lift others. Let's do it. But back to the UK again, because at this point, I've got really deep concerns about my friend. So Alana's at church, and I want to shield Alana from the whole world, right? Alana's been through a lot, and I want to protect her. And a faith crisis is probably not what she needs right now either. All my friends are leaving. I would quite like them to stay in. Our ward was having a really tough time, and this was going to be big, and I knew it was going to affect, in a very human way, it was going to affect people. So I spoke to Alana, and I was like, look, I'm going to have to give you a heads up. There's this stuff that is going down. And Alana immediately was, what can I do? So she had requested the Protect LDS Children bumper stickers for her car, displaying them proudly, telling other people in the church what these bumper stickers were all about. She was such an advocate for your cause, and for the broader cause. Was asking about safety within the buildings. The young women's door was the only one which didn't have a window in it. And in a lot of ways, she was being very, very shut down by leaders for just asking questions. And that's something that's really, really stayed with her. when she's amplified her concerns, it was seen as a threat. And I feel like that's kind of what happened with you. I think I kind of maybe did the same, you know, like we can go up to this point, but as soon as it becomes just too challenging. So when you did the march with all of these stories, the fact that the church that the church representatives were accepting those stories with grace and allowed space for the people who physically handed those stories over to them, I thought it was wonderful. Today, I would like to know, why do you think the apostles didn't come down and accept those stories that you had about? Could you maybe talk a little bit about what that looked like and what the invitation was you had extended and why they didn't accept it?
Well, there were two events where I invited the church leaders, the apostles. The first was the march. We're going to march the stories up there. We would like, and I'm in contact, because you can't reach the apostles or any other church leaders. When I reached the end of my rope with the stake president, I said, well, I'm going to I wrote 2 letters to the apostles. Now, the apostles say, don't write us. We're just going to send it back to your stake president. So I told the stake president, could you forward my letters on to the apostles? Now, he told me he did, but he also said he never got any response. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but that's what he said. But the first time we invited them was to accept the stories. They sent a PR representative. They sent a woman to accept them that has no authority. Now, you know, women are wonderful, but in the Mormon church, you're right. I think one of the reasons that this issue didn't gain traction in the past, because women would have spoken out, and they don't have authority in the church. When Alana did what she did, talking to the leaders, well, you know what? Alana is a woman, not a former bishop, not a wealthy elders quorum president or whatever. So they sent a woman. I was super disappointed about that we have no church leadership. Now, why didn't they send a church representative? It would only be speculation on my part. No church leader has ever told me why they didn't send anybody. But I think they might have thought that would give some validation to our movement. The church has a stand of we don't apologize for anything. Well, here we're presenting them hundreds of stories of how the church has dreadfully harmed. And we had, as we're presenting those 15 books for the 15 apostles, I had a person present the book. Each book, each of the 15 was a victim that presented that, and some of them talked about their story a little bit. But I think just that, I think the church, that is not in their modus operandi to publicly apologize or recognize harms that they have done.
And it was...
They were more worried that someone might touch the building. Because they had that law, didn't they? It was hilarious watching it. You know, this sea of people who'd walked up the street to the church headquarters. They did, you know, you'd forewarned them, so they had someone there to receive these books, one for each of the apostles, with all these stories in that people had contributed to their lived experience. But they kept obsessing about, you're not allowed to touch the building, like don't touch the walls. And it was just such a ridiculous sort of contrast.
I think that was the magic of it too, that this was the first time that we could really participate globally in some kind of, I mean, we've got General Conference, which is, you know, General Conference, you know, we could all be part of this worldwide, and you know, people were holding signs up who had traveled to be with you. But I mean, how awesome is that? But we were there with you, and what we are seeing there was compassion. I thought the woman who accepted the stories did a beautiful job of what she did. But then you've got a guy behind her that someone sort of accidentally just brushed the building with their fingertips and was publicly reprimanded for doing that. while the world is watching, and it was so embarrassing and so horrific. The thing worth mentioning here too is that I think for me it's less about supporting a movement than supporting the fact that these stories were being taken. These were about accepting these stories and the testimonies of people who, you know, we use the word victim because they didn't all survive. All of these people who shared their stories, there are people who lost their lives due to, you know, the circumstances that had happened. These were honest. Some were short. Some were long. What I really thought was beautiful was as the people who had shared their stories were handing over each book. Some were handing over with words of pain and grief. Some were handing them over and were so angry. And oh my God in heaven, that was beautiful. It was just a beautiful sight, and to see this opportunity to, you know, for healing be missed. I guess that was my question. You know, if Jesus was there, he would have been there. Well, Jesus was there. The rest of them were up in the building, I guess. Okay. So, in the meantime, back to the UK, and now that light is shining on, there's this issue within Mormonism. News agencies are picking it up from here. So, Peter, would you come back to what's starting to occur here?
Yeah, so we're rewinding a bit before the Climb a Mountain and Wave Your Flag campaign and the Sam doing a hunger strike, a fast, and inviting, you know, being present in Salt Lake, inviting people to come to talk to him, and the presentation, the petition. So quite early on, just when the petition itself was underway, I think a journalist reached out to you and I think it was a freelance journalist who'd picked up on the story through media connections in Australia. And I think, if I remember correctly, Sam sent and sort of a distress call. Is there anyone here from Britain who could talk to journalists? So three of us responded. So it's myself, David Shepherd, who I knew a little bit, sort of growing up in my area, and Stephen Blomfield, who's from a different state, and each with very different sort of backgrounds and experiences. Stephen was an active but sort of no longer believing church member, going to church though with his believing wife and children to support them. David Shepherd was very young. He was still processing in his own mental health a lot of the consequences of some of these things, and working out how to respond to it all. And we kind of said, okay, yes. And pretty quickly we found out we were going to be on the BBC, on the British Broadcasting Company's flagship morning news programme, Victoria, Derbyshire. And Victoria at the time, I think, had cancer, was battling cancer. So another journalist stepped in. I keep forgetting her name. I've got to remember. She was an amazing young Asian journalist who was sort of comparing the show, as it were. So we sort of were given a date to turn up at Broadcasting House in London to appear on the morning news and talk about this whole thing. And it like I can't emphasize enough. This is like being on CBS, sort of on the evening news. It was pretty big stuff, and we're like, oh my gosh, why would they even care? There's hardly any Mormons in Britain. You know, we're not that big a story, and this is a very small story. And we were like, we have got to make the most of this opportunity. I mean, because it does speak to larger issues. So we turned up. We'd done some emailing together. We'd prepared sort of our lines, or some of the key points we wanted to make. We'd agreed a bit of strategy between us. You know, that the focus here is not on criticizing individuals or anything. We took Sam's lead on that. You know, it's about a system, and just appealing for people to make reforms and change it and make things safer. And the operation at Broadcasting House is amazing because It's an incredible choreography, because to have a 1 hour news show with several different items, you've got all the different green rooms with the people for that. You have journalists behind the scenes who are prepping you. You've got to get your own act together. And then you're sitting in the studio on the side while the previous item's being dealt with. These cameras are all moving completely silently with these incredible cameramen. So it was amazing. It's like the Starship Enterprise. So just being in that situation was kind of, wow, ooh, but we've got a message and we've got to get it across and not like fluff it up completely. And there was some backroom drama. Stephen's family were kind of suddenly realized the scale of what he was about to do. And he was getting messages from them that they were not happy about this. And he managed to sort of talk them into letting him do it. But there was a possibility he'd have to pull out. I just can't emphasize enough how brave both he and David were. The worst I suffered or sacrificed from this was I had the worst haircut of my life on national television. That was my sacrifice. Always go to the barber before you're on the news. It's my advice. But they had, deep, painful stuff to deal with, and there was going to be a high social cost for participating. And we ended up with about a quarter of an hour. I mean, it was astonishing. The questions were brilliant. I'm so sorry, Sam. Well, I thought I had a couple more hours. I was going to throw together a quick edit of some highlights, but we could put it in the links or something.
Yeah, we'll do that.
We'll upload the film. But it was amazing. Very intelligent, thoughtful questions. We were able to talk about our experience, our concerns, that this church that we love and have huge respect for and has been a blessing in our lives, however, does this thing which is harmful and dangerous. It was quite funny in places. David talked about how he first heard about masturbation in a bishop's interview. It was like, what is this? And went home and tried it and had a lovely time ever since, And it was so that was hysterical. And Stephen was just talking about his concerns about being a father of daughters, very much like you, Sam, and what's going to happen to them, what sort of system are they going to be fed into here, and what should we do about this? And we were also making the point that this is a wider issue of safeguarding for a lot of religions, not just ours, so we wanted to make it's not just a Mormon thing, let's all think about how we can all do better for this issue. And at the end, they had some quotes from actually some people we know, sort of some stake president, and who they quoted about, saying, "Oh, this, it's lovely, it's wonderful, it's good for the youth to have these leaders, speaking to them, and it's good, it's all great, and I've never had a problem with it." And we were just sitting there, sort of poker face, because it was so self-evidently ridiculous after everything we'd said. And but also, they've got a statement from the Europe area presidency, which also we had no idea was going to suddenly be pulled out of a hat at the end of our little item, in which it repeated the sort of the PR line from HQ that, we have gold standard sort of child protection, and we are always looking to improve it, to do better. And that was brilliant. That was like the yes, thank you, because it was basically a commitment to do the best we can, to be open to suggestions, to say we will keep improving this to do the best for children. So I love that. Obviously it was PR fluff, but it was a public statement representing the area presidency saying we will do better if you can point out how. So the whole thing was quite surreal. We kind of were a bit shell-shocked afterwards. We were amazed that we'd had so much time to talk it through and say the things we needed to say. And I won't waffle on, but obviously there were then aftermath. Like this, for the first time in Britain, got loads of attention because it's like, oh, hang on, the Mormons are on telly. Oh no, we're usually paranoid at that point, like it's going to be a disaster. And it got a lot of attention for the cause and for the petition, and a lot of positive things actually snowballed from there. So, in particular, my stake leadership created a much more robust safeguarding policy. It was already well underway. We, for the same reasons everyone else had concerns. The bishop, I wasn't living in the ward at the time, but a couple of years before we moved there, the bishop of my ward was arrested and imprisoned for child pornography offences while serving as bishop. I think a high councillor had also been in that situation. One of the leading sisters in the stake founded a fostering agency, so she, as a professional, was all over safeguarding. And we have all these professionals, like people in I'm a teacher, so I get safeguarding training. The church is teeming with people who, in their professional lives, have A-grade, gold standard, proper child safeguarding training. And yet we put up with amateur, dangerous nonsense at church, and the two don't join up. So a lot of these people had already been lobbying for a long time to have a decent safeguarding, because the church was not providing one, policy. And so they had one sort of ready to dust off. And we had a new stake president who was very concerned about this, totally supportive. The sister who founded the foster agency, he immediately called as Stake Relief Society president, and it was like, go for it. And he very graciously involved me. He sent me a copy of this draft. He asked me to add anything I could from my experience with teacher training, which I did, and that got added to this policy. So we now, in our stake, have a safeguarding policy which says that anyone working with young people must have a police background check, and that anyone working with young people must have annual professional training. And the irony is we can do it in-house. We've got enough people who do this professionally as members of our stake that we can just do it with people in our own wards training. But local councils in Britain do offer free safeguarding training every year to voluntary organisations, so you can do it for free. And that was amazing. And just final point, he didn't feel he could go as far as saying we can't have one-to-one interviews. The stake president is very keen not to politicize it or to be a rebel, or to become part of a campaigning thing. So that was always a bit tricky. So he didn't go as far as that, because that would be a step beyond the official guidelines. But he took responsibility. Our local leaders took responsibility, and they made the changes that Sam was advocating for, pretty much. And that was remarkable, and it showed what's possible.
Yeah, definitely. And
Remarkable.
we're going to
Yeah.
come back and talk about safeguarding just shortly, but yeah, Sam, before I come back to ask about what happens next, what's happening as a result of the march and all this media attention, I'd also like to share from a grassroots level. Great things were happening amongst the memberships of the UK. Naturally, there was a lot of nervousness and concern that, this guy is raising a problem that we don't have a problem with in our church. Then you've got members who are very, very behind it and totally agree, because not only does it make sense, but having either experienced or read the stories themselves, see that change needs to happen. So I'm going to talk about that change in a second, but I wanted to just quickly share the night before you guys did the Victoria Derbyshire interview and the BBC story was dropping, and we've put the link to that in the show notes. I spoke to my bishop because I knew someone who's very, very beloved by Alana and me, I get to love them too, had spoken to me about was one of the people who'd spoken to the BBC. And while their story wasn't used in its entirety, it was kind of alluded to in the article, I was so horrified about the fact that we're talking about real people and that this is happening in our ward, in our state. Like you're saying, Peter, this happens everywhere because that's the nature of abuse. It happens, and where there's vulnerabilities, predators exploit those vulnerabilities, and we are vulnerable to this. And I had shared my concern with my bishop that when he said this isn't a problem, I had sort of said, well, this is going to be, you're going to wake up tomorrow and your ward might be in complete free fall because this might be your news headline tomorrow, and you know, we need help. We need to know what you're going to do as a ward. And the response to it was worse than denial. The response to it was that the bishop contacted a friend of his who spoke to his wife, who then called the person who had spoken to the BBC to ask for their explanation about, I heard that you're going to see this. Abuse was reported to a bishop, and in the space of 30 minutes, it made all its way back to the person who had reported it. And when he called me about it later to sort of ask what had happened, I was so ashamed. I let you down. I let your confidence and my anger detract from the broader story. And I will never let that happen again. And I am so sorry. And you know, the person knows that, and the person is incredible. But to see us continue to let victims down, even when you think it's good intentions. I just had wanted to share that with you guys. Anyway, Sam, what happened next now that we've got all of this global attention? They give you an award. Yeah, they give you an award. They're like, the church is like, Sam, thank you. Just stay forever, right?
Well, the day before the march, the church did make a change. And they asked me, are you going to continue with the march anyway? Why don't you cancel the march? And so I really thought this was great that the church has made a change based on how many people are now starting to recognize and support and speak out. And they made the day before the march was that a second person could be allowed in the youth interviews if the child requests it. Okay, well, wait a minute. There's no child that's going to request that. But the news sometimes the news headlines kind of get things wrong. They highlight things that'll get readers. Well, they got the headline wrong, but it was a great headline because it says something like this: LDS Church now allows another person in the interview, something like that. They didn't say anything about the child, but that's what everybody was remembered. Not everybody. That's what a lot of people took away from that.
Yeah.
People in the church that, okay, I can go into this interview with my child. I'm not going to let my child have any more interviews alone. Well, that's not the way the policy reads. It's got to be the kid that asks for it. But that was an opening, and still is an opening, that sent a message that having two people in that room is okay. Now, the reason I didn't stop the march was that, wait a minute, that's a very small step, a meaningful step, but small. There should be no one-on-one interviews. And what about the sexual questions? There's no change about that. The bishop can still ask any question he wants that can be super harmful to that child. Okay, so after the march, now I'm going to tell you what happened and answer your question. But first, I want to share something I haven't shared with anybody until right now. And it has to do, Peter, with this BBC interview. So, I got tons of messages. I still have thousands of emails and messages that I haven't even looked at yet. But I would try to look at stuff as well as I could. And you'd get these, you'd get threats, you're going to hell and all that. But then I got tons of supportive stuff too. And then a lot of just odd stuff. Well, here is one of the odd ones. I got an email from a person whose last name was Anonymous. Have you ever heard the last name Anonymous? Her first name was Anne. So the message came from Anne Anonymous. And I looked at that and thought, maybe Anonymous is a last name. But they said they may have some connections in the UK that for a where news could get out there. Well, okay, good. I'm super interested in that. So we corresponded a little bit as I don't know if it's a he or she. We'll just say it's a she. It was Anne Anonymous. And so this person eventually starts talking about Victoria Derbyshire. I have never heard of this person. I Googled and there it is, but I didn't know if it was a prominent thing or something that comes on at 1 a.m. and 3 people watch. But he said, I think we're going to be able to get on this. And that's when I sent the message out. I put that message several places and got your responses. And, even when you send the messages out, like, I don't know where you read that message, but I posted on Reddit was one place I posted, and you get a lot of feedback of, why would anybody give you their name? Because this could be the Protecting the Church Committee, whatever that committee is, looking for
strengthening the church members committee.
Yeah, that it could be a member of that trying to ferret out people in the church that they don't like, or that they view as a threat. But obviously, I had been as visible enough that people knew me, and so Peter and few other people responded, but we ended up with the 3 there. So that's how it happened. You were on the BBC because of dear old Ann Onimus. So Ann, if you're watching this, thank you very much for the efforts you went through. And she is still anonymous to me.
I love that.
Wow.
So they didn't make a statue to Sam Young, and
we will one day. It's on the list, Sam.
Yeah.
It will happen.
Yeah, we will make a statue to Sam. But yeah, what happens next for you? Because again, this you're trying to help the church you love. You're trying to, these are humans with human story. Each story is a person, and their life and all the lives that touch them. What happens next?
So then I'm looking at, what do you do next? Because there still hasn't been a lot of change. There are still tons of people in the church that are not aware of this. There's still tons of people that are out of the church that are not aware of this and may join the church blithely thinking their children are safe with this gold standard that the church advertises. So I eventually settled on doing a hunger strike, because prominent people have done that, and it's done it moved causes forward in a significant way. So yeah, the next step was the hunger strike, and there was a lot of stuff behind the scenes with regards to that that I don't know if you want me to go into or not. But the next thing was a hunger strike on Temple Square.
Please go into behind the scenes, because I want to know what it was like for you. You are a man of great faith. What is going on for you?
Okay, so now remember, I'm also I was never traumatized like people that went through this, but reading hours every day of these stories of how people are harmed, it gets in you, and it's still in me. When I talk about this, emotion comes up, not emotion of anger, but emotion of just the tragedy of what's happened to people. So all that's weighing on me. How do we move this forward? And so I decided I was going to do a hunger strike. Now, my wife had already told me 2 months before, because I broached this right after the march. She said, no way, you are not going to do a hunger strike. So, maybe in the Mormon church, the women don't wield much power. In the Young household, they do. And so I finally decided to do the hunger strike, maybe July 1st. The hunger strike started maybe the end of July. But I didn't dare tell my wife. But I started researching it. I got in touch with a doctor to ask the question, okay, because she was concerned that if you do a hunger strike like 3 weeks long, you're going to be dead, or your health is going to be damaged for life. So anyway, I talked to this doctor. What do? You need to prepare for it. So he gave me a regimen on how to prepare for it as far as the diet. So I started working on that diet, so the first week you eliminate stuff. The second week you eliminate stuff. The third week you have nothing but fruits and vegetables. And then the fourth week, it's not many fruits and vegetables. But the whole family seeing me do this, and they're excited about me on this diet regimen to lose weight. But I didn't have I still hadn't build up to telling my wife what I wanted, what I was planning on doing. So about 3 weeks into it, I was talking with Patty, and she said, you know, Sam, I believe that Jesus Christ is guiding your actions, that this is a result of that you're following what Jesus is inspiring you to do. Now I heard that and thought, okay, this is a little opening the door that I can talk about. This. If she thinks Jesus is directing me, hey, this is the next thing I think Jesus is telling me to do. And incidentally, I never have ever thought this is Jesus telling me what to do. It was the entire time is any rational human being that cares about their children. This is, you would speak out against this to protect your children, your grandkids, and your friends and so on, your community. Anyway, so I felt like I could tell her. So yeah, this is about 2 weeks before I was going to start the fast. And so I told her. She was very supportive. I led off with, you shared with me, you thought Christ is directing me. And she was good with it for a week. So a week later, anger comes out. She does not want me to do the hunger strike. She's adamant, no way can you do this. So we talked about it for a week on this. This is what I want to do, honey. I kept on the regimen. And finally, a few days before I was scheduled to go to Salt Lake City, she was pretty angry when she started this conversation. And, you know, angry, she's protective of me. You know, this is our marriage. It's just her and me, baby. And so this is a big risk to her. She didn't want to see bad things happen to me by having a long hunger strike. She asked me why I wanted to do this. And frankly, I can't even remember what I said. I just know I broke down bawling about why I wanted to do this, why I felt like this was an important thing. You know, I could probably come up with the reasons why, but I've forgotten them at this point. I just know that it was super emotional. She started crying. And at the end of that, she says, Sam, you need to do this. Let's go forward and do this. So that was kind of the backdrop. And I've been announcing on Facebook something is going to happen, and Reddit and blogs, something is going to happen. The next action, the church has never faced this before. And it's going to be a major thing. I didn't know it was going to be major. I didn't know that there had been a hunger strike by a member of the church before, but Sonia Johnson had done a hunger strike in Salt Lake City years and years ago. So I'd been advertising it. It's going to start soon. Well, the day before, actually, I was going to, and I hadn't announced this, I was going to start it like this certain day, a Friday, at 5:00 is when I'm officially going to start my hunger strike. But I'm not going to tell anybody what I'm doing until that following Sunday, which is when I announced it on a press conference. So Friday night, Friday afternoon, about 2:00, I got a call from a general authority. Got a call from one of the 70. He said that he had been requested that one of the apostles had contacted the public affairs, and asked public affairs to contact him to contact me. This is a guy that was used to be from my stake before he was called as general authority. I was his ward mission leader when he was bishop. Then I was the high counselor while he was on the stake president. And, you know, the high counselors, when somebody drops off, you advance around the table. And so I was the number one high counselor for the last year or so that he was our stake president. And then he was called from that into the general authorities. And I talked to him a couple times about this, but they were just weird conversations. Well, he was trying to talk me out of doing what, and by that point, the general authorities from a different interaction now knew what I was going to do, this fast. and he was trying to talk me out of from doing it. After an hour conversation, he kept telling me how important the children are. We need to protect the children. I'm a big advocate. He says, well, fine, good. Let's you and me go in and talk to the general authorities. You can talk to them. I can't get them to respond to me. And so several times it came back to that as he was telling me how important they were. Well, good. Let's make this important. Let's go in and talk to them if they're that important. But anyway, nothing resulted from that phone call. Okay, so that's basically all the backdrop behind starting the hunger strike. Now, once the hunger strike started, once I announced it that Sunday at the press conference, I started inviting an apostle every day. We had a chair set up outside of Temple Square, and a specific apostle starting at the bottom. We worked up to President Nelson, and during those 23 days, did a Facebook Live from Temple Square where we invited victims, concerned parents, concerned people, anybody that wanted to come address the world about this issue. And we had there were over, I don't know, a ton of people that ended up coming to that, and a lot of tender moments, tender things shared. The day that, so 15 days in, the day that President Nelson was invited, we actually had a special meeting, kind of like a sacrament meeting. There were about 300 people that showed up for that. We completely filled the venue. It was on all the TV stations in town, at least on the news, but all the cameras were there, and where we basically spoke about this. Had a couple victims speak, had a therapist who had interacted with children, adults who were harmed as children by this practice. We then had the church may not apologize, but I'm a bishop. I was a bishop at the time. And we had like 30 bishops, no, about 60 bishops sign an apology to the victims of these interviews. And that was read publicly at that point in time. So at the end of, and then ended up going 23 days. And frankly, I would have gone longer. I would recommend to the two of you, if you want a very cool experience, go on a 23-day fast. It was one of the most, it ranks up there in the absolute most wonderful experiences I've ever had. I didn't want to quit. At that point, you're no longer hungry. You're just full of energy. Your mind is working great. Smells, all the smells are wonderful. You're just attuned to things that you weren't quite as attuned to in the past. I didn't want to stop, but my wife said, Sam, this is it, 23 days. Over 3 weeks, you got to quit. So I quit and flew home at that point.
I love that you did it under medical supervision. I think that's pretty important. You know, your family and medical supervision, and yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, about 2 weeks into it, maybe a week and a half into it, I had a doctor come up and do a physical and do the tests and whatnot.
So then the church listened and changed its policies, right? No.
They did that. They did a little change in policy the day before the march, but the excommunication, first of all that 23 days, and then the excommunication, which we'll talk about next, all that, what it did, it raised the level of awareness, just continued to amplify the level of awareness, which helps victims, which helps parents, which helps children stay out of harm's way. So the awareness wasn't just for awareness, it was for the amazing things that come out of the awareness. And by the way, when I started this, I was aiming for policy changes. I didn't know, I was clueless at all the harms that had happened. So a wonderful side benefit that became a major benefit was all the validation and healing that occurred for those that had been harmed. And all of it just continued to help people in that realm, in that way. So no changes were made after that, except for, they did make changes later on. The next year they made some changes, but the
let's just underline that. after you were excommunicated, then changes were made.
Yep. So then a week after I got home, and frankly, I was thinking I've done enough. I've spent way too much money in this. I was planning on spending $1,000, and okay, well, to do that, it's going to cost this much. Well, okay, 5,000. Then to do some 10,000, and finally, after the 10,000 mark, when I'm moving into the planning for the march, it was I have a one-time shot at doing this. So my retirement fund, I've got a retirement fund that I'm pulling from already, and so I felt like after the hunger strike, good, I'm done. I've spent enough money. I've spent way too much money. I've raised the awareness huge time. I think I'm done with this. Not done with the cause, but I've done enough at this point. And then I got a letter delivered by two of my friends that I've known for years. The doorbell rang. There they were in their suits, letter in hand. I knew exactly what it was. I invited them in. I opened the letter as they were sitting on a couch in my living room and, read that I was being called to a disciplinary council. And so that, frankly, I saw that and I looked at it. Good. They just put another megaphone in my hands. I am going to use this to continue to raise awareness. And so the trial continued, the court was convened. That was frankly a hard situation. I felt like I was betrayed by my friends in this, that nobody was willing to stand up. So they said I could bring witnesses, but they had to be members in good standing in the church. Well, I've got witnesses, but you know what? That would stand up and say, Sam's not against the church. I'm not against the church. I'm against this policy. That's all I'm calling out. I'm not speaking out against the prophets, the doctrine, God, the church, just this policy. But none of my friends would be willing to say he's not opposing the church. But I had an ace in the hole. A former fellow that I'd worked with in Young Men's. Then I was ward mission leader while he was bishop. Then I was on the high council when he was bishop in the number one spot because he replaced the fellow that was called into general authorities. And he had gone on a mission, and after that, as a mission president, come back. I had met with him I gave him a call when he came home just to say, hey, welcome home, just took him out to lunch. And somehow we got on this topic of what I was doing. And this may have been November of 2017 when we were in the midst of the petition. And so I talked to him about that, and he said, Sam, somebody needs to stand up and protect the children. Good for you. This is a good thing. I thought, oh my gosh, this is wonderful. Friend of mine, bishop, stake president, mission president, and validating that somebody needs to stand up about this. So I gave him a call and told him what I was calling to ask him to be a witness, and that all I wanted to witness for was I'm not against the church. I'm just against a policy. And this was about 10 o'clock at night when I finally was able to reach him. And my wife was out of town. There was nobody at home. I had just attended an anniversary for a friend of mine. And so I was out in the parking lot in the car when I finally got the call back from him and explained the situation. And I knew he's going to stand up for me. He's the one that said, Stan, somebody needs to do what you're doing. He refused. It was like a knife stuck in my belly. It just hurt so bad that there's none of my friends. All my friends have deserted me, and the one guy that had said what I was doing was right, he was not willing to stand by that. So this was a few days before the court was going to start. I'd already asked my wife to be a witness, and she was my only witness. And went in there not to so she talked about me, all the kids, I've got 6 daughters. All the daughters had input on what her remarks were going to be. She had 15 minutes or 10 minutes, something like that. And so they helped her even my active kids helped her in writing this thing, because my active kids supported what I was doing. But that night, when I realized that everybody's deserted me, those thoughts of I've built my life on this. I was totally dedicated to this church. That's where I put all my efforts, not into my business, not into my livelihood, but into the church. And that is all gone. They've now deserted me, and they're likely to kick me out. You have thoughts of suicide, and those came along from time to time. I mean, I wasn't ready to go commit suicide, but I now realize that almost everybody has suicidal ideation at some point in time. So I'm sitting there thinking, can I swear on this show?
Of course.
So I'm sitting there, and I've been restrained about that with this. I'm going to go home to an empty house with a knife sticking in my belly, thinking about, do I want to end it here? My life is worthless now. The thoughts that can come up when you're depressed. And finally, I just said, fuck it. I'm going to a movie. So that I went to see a movie at 10:30. Now, something interesting happened. I bought my popcorn and drink, and as I'm walking into the theater, we have emotions that can be overwhelming, like the suicidal ideation, like my gut just being wrenched. And then I almost fainted as I'm walking into the movie. So I had to set my stuff down, lean it against the shelf that was there, and just, think, am I going to be able, what do I do? And, you do calm yourself down, and you do. And I went to the movie, and it took me a couple days. My wife was gone for a couple days, and that was a Friday. I can't remember the day it was, but it took a couple days. And then I was, okay, I'm ready to go. I'm going to go attack this thing again. I'm going into this council with my head held up high, even though they all deserted me. I'm going to hold it up high, and I'm going there to defend the children. I'm going to read stories and demonstrate to them, or help them understand what we are doing to our kids. When I walked into that room, now all these people are my friends, right? I know all these people. The stake president was about as, the signaling from him was, I hate you. Just his persona is, I hate you. There was no shaking of hands, nowhere. All the men that I'd worked with for years, I've been on many disciplinary councils. You say hi to the person that's walking in. You want to love them. You want to support them. We're holding this council not to punish you, but to help you. Well, all my friends were looking down at the table. They wouldn't look at me. I don't know if the stake president said, don't look at him. What I think is the stake president prefaced this thing with some very bad remarks about me. So they're all looking at the table. My wife's comments, they're all looking at the table. They weren't looking at her. I started my talk, my presentation, which I think was about 40 minutes long. They limit you to an hour. And they as soon as I read this first story that is just so gruesomely bad, so sad, they started looking at me and listening to me. When we're done, normally you get a verdict. No verdict. The stake president said, we're not going to deliberate today. I don't think they ever deliberated, frankly. We'll announce a verdict later on. And every single council I've ever been in, when it ends, then everybody walks over to the guy that's on trial and shakes their hand, gives him a hug. The first guy sitting right next to me, who I've worked with for years, he extended his hand. I shook his hand. And we both smiled at each other. And then the stake president said, there's going to be no shaking of hands. We're dismissing you. I just thought, this is not a council of love. This was a council that I had never seen before. This was a council opposite of love, which might be fear, might be hate. I don't know what it was, but it was no way was it like any council I have ever participated in.
Peter, this I'm just curious, if this must be stirring up quite a lot for you. I, when this was happening, I remember that my biggest concern, keeping in mind, I had reached out to Sam, I think many people did, who would have happily testified as members of good standing in your behalf, and you had, but it's the fact that your friends, the people who should have shown up, didn't. But as much as I'm concerned for Sam and all of this work that you've done, my concern is for Alana. My concern is for the people whose stories you've been sharing, but specifically that for me is personified in my best friend, who when I have to tell her, what has just happened, we're going to have to get on a call and talk you through as you process this stuff. My biggest concern was, what is this going to do to my friend and the other people who are being told that this is too dangerous, that this is wrong, that this isn't welcome, that you are too much, that you went too far, that you crossed the line, that and trying to identify as a faithful member what sin would have been committed that would be worthy of excommunication, of throwing you out and showing you the door. And we had that. You were the first experience we'd had of that kind of reaction, which would then be followed by other people, which would be followed by Natasha, and would be followed by Peter, people that we care for, who are trying to do this good work. And Sam, I'm so sorry that happened. I am so sorry.
Well, Jane, my wife doesn't share your sentiment. She told me, Sam, I'm glad you were excommunicated. She felt that would kind of get me out of all the consternation that I had about the church, and it kind of did. But yeah, she was glad I was excommunicated.
Yeah.
She didn't want it to happen. She was glad when it happened.
Peter, how did the UK handle the news of the excommunication? What was happening in the Bloggernacle and in the UK?
I think it was. Sorry, okay.
No, we're getting a lot of crackle right now, Peter. Could you maybe
interference? Sorry. I'm gonna try. I'll try to use different headphones. Just to help. It's a bit funny.
Yeah, that's perfect. We've got you now.
Yeah, we're on. Okay, cool. I don't know what it is with these. I'm getting better internet connection soon. I think it was kind of Sam Young's excommunication was part of this sort of parade of quite well publicized excommunications of John Lynn, Kate Kelly, Bill Reel. They got recorded. Did yours get recorded, Sam? So it all kind of blurs into one. Did you record yours? I can't remember if you taped yours.
It ended up getting recorded. I don't want to go into the details of that.
Oh yeah. So it was random. The aliens recorded it and popped it online for everyone to hear. So it was very powerful. We were all living along this with you. We could see the injustice of the whole situation. Of course, it wasn't a surprise because we know what the church is like. No one was shocked that they would decide to punish you after, in a sense, acknowledging you are right by making a policy change, while pretending, of course, he had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the Protect LDS Children campaign, which was just ludicrous. And it's almost like this is the price you have to pay. We'll throw you a bit of meat, but the price is your membership. You will be excommunicated because you've committed the unforgivable sin of daring to challenge the leaders or shame them with truth. Force them to face up to their own failings, which they're not happy about. So, I mean, you absolutely entered martyr status at that point. You always had anyway. and you absolutely had the right approach of, well, if you want to hand more publicity to me on a platter, that's fine, let's do it. And that was, and so much props to you. And we know it was painful and difficult, and you expressed that very powerfully. And all these people who have been through this, even though in a sense it wasn't a surprise that the church came after their membership, it's still painful. And I remember John Dehlin very much, sort of talking about that period afterwards of sort of a crash, um, and I just have to thank you personally. The whole thing you taught us, and I think this is only beginning to play out in what you pioneered, and other people have, of course, as well. But you did it particularly skillfully, I think. It's the idea that you can be an ordinary member of the church, and if you are just stubborn, if you just refuse to take no for an answer, and you persist, you can break through all the glass ceilings they will put in your way. They will try and talk you out of it behind the scenes. And you said no. You called their bluff, like, oh, really? The leaders care about this? Great, let's have a meeting. Of course, that didn't happen. And you just kept going, and you were learning on the job, and we were all learning with you. You had like hundreds, thousands of people following your journey. You were very open. I mean, the time you invested in sharing this with us, now I'm a podcaster, I fully appreciate the sacrifice of your own time while trying to carry on your daily work and have a job, and the sacrifice of your family, of the time that this took over months. I think all of them, we all owe them a debt of honor and thanks for what the whole team, as it were, sacrificed and to pull this off. And you were sort of behind and you involved everyone, behind the scenes. You were like, oh, I've got to do a press conference. How do those work? What do I even do? And everyone was able to sort of, where they could, give some advice and support. And you just kept going, and you played the media brilliantly. You understood the game, and you were determined. Um, uh, and every time you appeared in front of a camera, you were you were positive, you were upbeat, you were cheerful. And we all knew that at times this is really taking a toll behind the scenes. But every time you brought it with simplicity. You didn't get sidetracked. It was the one thing over and over again. And you absolutely sort of carried the torch for that cause, and you kept it simple, but you had great creative imagination in how, on all the different ways to keep the media cycle going and give it attention. And I have to just say, and stepping back from this particular issue, which is crucially important, I just want to thank you on behalf of the Brit Vengers, on behalf of all the other people. You modeled for us. You can be an ordinary member of the church. Um, no, nothing special about you, except everyone is special and we all have our voices. Um, but if you are determined, the technology now, the voice that social media gives you, and the camera and the way that news cycles work, you can change the world. You can change this dinosaur of a broken institution that finds change takes decades to happen. And you can fast forward that. You can fast forward that shit. You made change happen. And I've got a buddy who, just every time I get in touch with him, he's like, you and Sam Young are heroes. I'm like, I'm not the hero, it's Sam. But he fully recognizes, the impact that your movement had. And it absolutely taught us so much. And again, it is obviously Bill Real and RFM and other people who've gone through similar journeys with their own sort of campaigns and focus. But you've taught us all, you can do it. Anyone can do this. If you're speaking truth, that is power. And its power is it resonates with people. You're not persuading them to believe something that is not natural to them, or that they weren't thinking anyway, or whatever. When you touch that nerve of a shared experience, a shared trauma, a shared concern, and you speak up about it, and you offer a pathway, you offer solutions, and you show people how simple the solutions could be, that is unstoppable, because the tide of history will be with you. You know, as Martin Luther King said, the arc of history bends towards justice. It becomes an inevitability. And I mean, eventually we'd have got there sometime at the end of this century, but by willing to make the sacrifices you did, you fast forwarded this issue spectacularly. You changed the whole landscape. You got people thinking, and it's still taking a while to percolate through, but it is, and it's becoming increasingly totally unacceptable to go alone into a room with untrained adults. And you know, recently California has just legislated that you can't do that anymore, which is amazing. So that will be somewhere in the heartland where members are going to have to get used to having background checks for anyone working with children. We know that Australia requires this by law already with their blue cards, and the church just cooperates. But they've never had the integrity to just actually have a gold standard safeguarding policy and to insist it's applied everywhere, that every child matters. And you were saying every child matters, not just where the law insists on it, but you'll get away with what you can where it doesn't, which is still, why is the church even doing that? It's flabbergasting that they can't just insist on best practice everywhere. You
So
know,
hold on to that thought,
anyway,
Peter, because we are coming to
you
that.
inspired us.
But yeah, we are Generation Sam. It's this is what you did. While we were talking about stories and well Sam was sort of trying to get into the stream, Peter had mentioned something about how this happens in every stake and had talked about the prevalence of abuse within a Latter-day Saint context. The policies have now changed and tightened up to the point where the church calls it a gold standard. Leaders who wouldn't have spoken out before in support of Sam Young have now sort of come out and said, yeah, this is great. We've got all of these great new improved policies and we have this training. So I have two questions for you both, and that is, first of all, how prevalent is it? This isn't that big of a deal. Surely this isn't that prevalent, right? And my second question is, but aren't our policies now tight? Isn't the training that we have that gold standard? Talk to me about what's actually going on out there.
Okay, so what is actually happening in the church today? I'm not really up to speed on that. I know what the policies are. So after we did the Protect LDS Children for a year, after my excommunication, we launched Protect Every Child. I'd had some people lightly reach out and said, how come you just are protecting LDS kids, talking about that? Shouldn't all kids? So great, you're absolutely right. There's problems everywhere. We'd like to have a movement that did reach more than just LDS, and we have an LDS base to work with. So we launched Protect Every Child, and we were calling for several things like training, that we should have required training. Well, guess what? That year the church implemented a required training. Now, it's not the gold standard, it's substandard, but at least they implemented it. You do stuff like that, you announce it to your ward, you announce it to the stake, you're trying to get people to take it. Well, that is some focus. So some people are going to be reached. There is going to be some protection for children from that. So that was a very good thing. I applaud them for doing that. So that might be the lead standard as opposed to the gold standard, but at least there's a standard there that helps out. If they want the gold standard, there's gold standards out there. The Boy Scouts, they've got a wonderful training. Darkness to Light, they've got a wonderful training. I had gone through both of those when I was doing Protect LDS Children and was really amazed at, because my eyes were being opened up too. I was this world of abuse I was not familiar with. So the training was very helpful to me to broaden my understanding of what we ought to be doing. But so that was a good thing. It needs to really be enhanced. But at least it's there. The other thing we're calling for were background checks. I'm glad to hear that your stake implemented that. Good job, your stake president. Thank heavens there are countries where you got a whole country that's concerned about it, like Australia. In the United States, we've had one state that has had that policy for a few years, where there has to be background checks and you have to have a regular mandatory training, child protection training, and so the church has been forced to support that in Pennsylvania. Why all churches just don't say, okay, we're going to protect our kids. Some churches do, but not all the churches don't do. And the LDS church certainly does not do that. They do it right now when they're forced to in Pennsylvania, in Australia, and now California. So California is now requiring background checks on anybody that works with kids. Hallelujah. That's a good thing. So there are good changes that are happening in our society. And, you know, I want to first of all, thank you for your kind words that you've said about me. And I read some comments. Thank you all for the very kind words. The things that we have done, not just me, but there's been tens of thousands of people involved in this, from the LDS Children to Protect LDS Children, Protect Every Child, that people see that. Now, I'm not taking credit for what happened in California or what happened in Pennsylvania. Good people that move those things forward. But everything that we, as tens of thousands of people, have done continues to raise awareness to help. It's just one more thing that helps move people to action to get protections in place in their own churches, in their own states, in their own countries.
You know, even people who are comfortable and confident with sharing their survivor stories and experiences are looking at are looking at how their stories are being received. They're looking at what people are saying about policies. They're looking at conversations like this and making decisions about, is my story being rejected? Or will my story be rejected? And that's happening right now. That is happening in this moment with people that you know. Peter, would you be comfortable to speak a little bit to what your views are on, is abuse training really needed in the UK? We have DBS checks. You know, there are things like that out there. And if the church needed it, wouldn't we have it?
I think all you have to do is talk to any long-term serving member of pretty much any ward, but certainly every stake, and they will all have horror stories. And there'll be plenty they don't even know about, but the ones that people just
Yeah.
know about. And whenever you start to have that conversation, it's, oh yeah, that terrible thing happened, and that person and the other. And of course it did, because sadly child abuse is endemic. In society. And frankly, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a Disneyland for child abusers if they want to come into this trusting community. Just as Utah is the affinity fraud capital of the United States of America, as I've been sort of covering in my podcast recently, so much so that the FBI has a permanent office there now. And more scandals recently, you've got a whole community that is very vulnerable to predators because there's a culture of trusting people who can wear a nice suit and sound sincere. And you've convinced people that they don't need to use their rational minds too much. You just trust your feelings. And those can be manipulated very easily. And of them and us sort of paranoid sense of everyone inside the church is safe, but the world outside is where the danger is. And of course, 101 of any kind of child protection effort is to understand that the vast majority of abusers are members of your own family and your close-knit community. They're not stranger danger, it's incredibly rare. So I think, you know, so absolutely, in answer to your question, there is the need, of course. And there absolutely, you know, we've lived through it in our wards. It's just been horrific having to process the implications of have it, knowing that you were sending your children into a bishop who ends up convicted of something, you then wonder, why did we do that? Why did we trust this person? And you have an existential crisis if you were one of the leaders who appointed that person. Why did God let us put that person in that position? The ripple effects of not having basic safeguarding protocols that would prevent a significant percentage of these situations even arising is just too much of a cost to the church. It's ludicrous that they're not more careful. I think my perspective as a professional is the number one thing they should be worried about is the bishops themselves. If any child makes an allegation against an adult who's been alone in a room with them, they've got no protection at all. It could destroy their life. It could destroy their family, their marriage, their career, to have accusations made, and because no one else was there as a witness, no one can back them up on what was said or done in that interview. I mean, they're incredibly vulnerable for their own common sense and for the church's duty of care, not just to children, but to its own amateur clergy. You should never, ever let an adult anywhere near a situation where they're alone with the child. Just don't do it. That should be obvious. And the fact that it isn't is really worrying. So that alone, if that works for people, if they're not bothered about protecting children, well, protect yourself, for a start.
Yeah,
I think just to talk specifically about what the policies are now. So now
please.
it's actually got in. So the progress, the child can request an adult in the room, if they've got the courage to do that. Of course, some parents are just saying, no, we'll be there, thank you. But still, the policy is ludicrous, as Sam pointed out, that the child's meant to protect themselves rather than the adults in the congregation or their own family. It doesn't anywhere mention a parent requesting that in the official policy. They do ask a parent to be there in the 11-year-old's first interview. Um, they and the shifting culture is happening. So what Sam's done has had a resounding impact, but it's still a snowball that's growing. It's not there yet, as we all acknowledge. But there's also been massive steps backwards. Um, in abandoning Boy Scouts of America because the church was about to be hit with a massive bill for its endemic child abuse in using scouting as its youth program, and what happened in church context there, they've bunged a ton of money at the Boy Scouts of America and run. Boy Scouts of America, as you said, at least had professional safeguarding training. So you'd at least have a few people in each ward regularly trained to a secular professional standard. Now, there is none of that. And all they have is this training movie that the Brit Vengers are going to be chewing on at some point soon, um, which it's pretty much all it does is say never be alone with the child, and don't be alone with the child, and click this button to show that you understand you mustn't be alone with the child. At no point anywhere does it address at all bishops' interviews and stake presidency interviews. And something we should always remember is the pattern for interviewing children and young people is every 6 months. And they want the bishop to do one of those, but the other ones are going to be delegated to his counselors. So you're relying on the skills and capability and child safeguarding protocols of both of the counselors of the bishop. It's not just the bishop and the stake presidency members. You suddenly got an exponentially larger number of adult men with no training having access to children in one-to-one situations. That hasn't changed. And the contrast, so they say don't be alone with the child, and that's the only message in this video, while ignoring being alone with the child in interviews as if it doesn't even happen or count, which is
Yeah.
astonishingly neglectful. But we all know that in professional training, you have to have so much else. You need to know what the signs of abuse are in different categories. You need intense training about how to handle a disclosure. What do you do when someone discloses? How you must be extremely careful about how you respond, because if you then ask leading questions, and we all know an amateur enthusiast, I would, without training, wants to just run with this and rescue this child, tell me all about it. Did this happen? Did that? And you ask leading questions. All of that will destroy a court case. All of that initial response and getting it wrong to a child's disclosure of abuse will absolutely ruin any chance of convicting that perpetrator because you have interfered with the witness. And you need very careful training to know what to do, that you don't get involved in interrogating the child, that your job at that point is to get extra support, to pass them on to the professionals in your line of authority for safeguarding, to write down everything they said to you to help you remember, because you will be asked to be a witness in court maybe months later. And that's just one example of the complexity of what real safeguarding training involves. None of that is there, or only in passing. And and you just compare. You walk into any Church of England or Methodist or Baptist church in Britain now, the first thing you're presented with at the door is their child safeguarding policy. It's a big blue poster
Yes.
in all these churches. Every toilet you go into in these churches, it's all on the wall. This is who you report to. This is our child safeguarding policy. This is what we do. These are our rules and boundaries to protect any children setting foot in this premises. And this is here's how you disclose. We have none of that. And it's embarrassing. It's a total utter shambles, and it's giving it's actually dangerous because it's giving the illusion that we are training people, and they have to do this silly video every 2
Yeah.
years or something. And it creates a false sense of security because none of
Exactly.
that is going to protect children. It
Yeah.
really isn't.
Would you say, Sam, how many stories are currently on the website that you've collected? How many stories are on the Protect the Children website?
It's over 1,000.
Did you anticipate?
There's over 1,000 on the website.
Yeah. Did you anticipate that there would be that many stories when you first started this?
I didn't know if I was going to get one story when I started it. And so when I first started it, we had I didn't understand abuse. I still don't understand abuse, but there are basic things I didn't understand, and about the sensitivities of people sharing their stories. And so I got a bit of pushback the first week or so as people are sharing their stories, and I had to change my approach to it. And so, no, I never anticipated this many stories would be on the website, and we still continue to get stories submitted. I guess probably every couple of weeks we get one or two additional stories that come in. So it's still a meaningful thing for people to share their stories.
And we have found that since the first episode where we began to cover the subject of abuse, we've been approached by people who have never shared their story. And that's the reason why we're talking about this in the way that we're talking about it tonight, because this is a real issue in the United Kingdom. This is a real issue in your state, in your ward. One of the things that I was really struck by is, because you had focused on Bishop's interviews. Obviously, we are concerned about sexual predators. We're worried about that stranger danger and people who are attracted to the church in order to perpetrate abuse. Now, that does happen. That has happened, and there are horrific experiences and people who have, been through that. But then you get these really seemingly benign stories of people love their bishops. People have confidence in their bishops. People can, you're in this situation of trust where a simple question is asked. Now, one of my concerns, I guess, one of people's concerns is that you're then groomed so that if people out with the church are speaking to you who maybe are in authority, they can get away with speaking in particular ways that normally would raise red flags in other areas. We get to see the situation where someone like Elizabeth Smart, a child who is sleeping in her bed, where an adult man can walk into her room and take her away without her even crying out. We breed a very complacent people here in the Latter-day Saint movement. But I guess what I wanted to really highlight is the fact that people aren't all bad and all good. You can have a wonderful Mormon bishop who asks this insanely inappropriate question that is on every level wrong, who feels that in that moment he's obeying God's will and he's doing what God would want him to do, and he's helping that person live the laws of God, trying to be a good person but engaging in this extremely problematic behavior. Does it make him not a good man, or does it make him a good man? You know, we live in this horrible, we can't ever know if someone's fully black or fully white, because that doesn't exist. I was raised in a childhood where extremely abusive practices happened in our home. And I was raised by my two elderly aunts, who I remember with fondness and love, and oh, they were so funny, and they didn't have to look after me. They chose to do that. That's one of the most Christ-like things a human being can do for another. And yet they were abusive, and they hurt me, and they damaged me. And I can't say that they were bad people, nor can I say that they were wonderfully heroic people. They can occupy two places in my mind. They can be both the angel and the person who caused me all of this trauma. Now, that's what I'm seeing most commonly here in the United Kingdom, is people who are shutting down conversations that we're not even allowed to have because we care about our wards so much. Those wards are extensions of our families, and to even suggest that there may be a harmful thing that has happened, we're talking about the people we know, we're talking about the people we love. A few months ago, we had a case that was reported in a local newspaper in Scotland, and I think we were pretty shocked at it. Ultimately, the reporting on the case was not good.
Jane?
But sorry, Sam. You please continue.
So you're about to move into this other thing. I would like to respond to your question about bishops asking questions. Mm-hmm. Does it make him a good man, not a good man? But first of all, state that I think the vast majority of bishops in the church are good men.
Yeah, right.
I think the predators are outliers, but there is a fertile ground for predators in the leadership of the church, because you can meet with kids one-on-one and ask them predatory questions, grooming questions. Now, so we do have some bad people, like Peter's bishop was a pedophile. That has happened many times. We continue to see this come out, news articles about church leaders that were predators. We need to have the protections to prevent that. But back to the other bishops, most bishops I think are good. Does it make them, but there's also a range from a pedophile to somebody that is going to feed their sexual need by voyeuristic questions that they're asking. Mm-hmm. So does it make a man bad to ask a boy, do you masturbate? Well, that sounds like a gross question to me, but it's part of the culture for a lot of bishops. Does it make a bishop a bad man if he asks a girl, ask one of my daughters, do you masturbate? Well, I don't know. I don't like that question, but why did he ask that? Is it part of the culture? If you ask a girl, which was asked by one of my daughters, one of my daughters was asked this question: have you had anal sex? What the hell, God damn it, was asked to my daughter was asked that question? Okay, does that make that bishop a bad man? I don't know, but I don't know. So there it is. It's hard to make that decision or judgment, and we shouldn't be judgmental about it, but I'm judgmental about it. I wish I'd known that happened when it happened, so I could have confronted that man at the time. But okay, or does it make a bishop a bad man if he asks a girl, do you masturbate? And she says yes. And the bishop then asks, Do you masturbate under or over your panties? Now, what the hell? Does that make him a bad man? I don't know. I'm just saying those questions should never, ever, ever, ever be asked. But they are permitted in the Mormon Church. When I was doing all my stuff, I was asking out there on that, outside of Temple Square every day, can you just, not every day, but several times I asked the question, can you just eliminate one of the, here's 29 despicable questions that are being asked. Can you just eliminate one of them? They've not eliminated anything. Bishop can still ask anything he wants. So that's a hard question to ask. Is a man bad if he asks a girl, do you masturbate under or over your panties? Is he a bad man? What would you think?
I would suggest in a way it almost doesn't matter, because the kind of the point here is it's the system. It doesn't matter about the individual morality of that leader. They're in a system that tells them to ask these questions to judge chastity. Now, the new guidelines do say don't ask intrusive questions, but the fundamental flaw in this whole system is they have not rewritten for the strength of youth. And all of the church guidelines and the handbook still say to leaders, adults, and children that for the strength of youth is the explanation of what the law of chastity is. And in 2 sections there about chastity and about forgiveness, it says that if you have any sexual thoughts or look at pornography, as soon as possible, you must talk to your bishop about it. And the repentance chapter is very specific that you must confess those sins, specifically any glimpse of pornography, to your bishop. So it tells you in that booklet, and this is the laziness of the leaders. They haven't done any joined up thinking. They've taken no responsibility for the fact that for the strength of youth, which they're still dishing out like confetti and naming now the whole youth program after this booklet, is telling them that you have to talk to your bishop about all these things and resolve those concerns, which is totally contradictory to telling the bishops not to go there. They haven't even got basic joined up thinking. This is how dysfunctional all the bureaucratic systems and the general authorities of the LDS Church are. It's a classic case that they just don't get it. They are completely incompetent. It's not just about a sinister conspiracy, it's incompetence when they could afford to hire anyone to give them a professional system. So that is really essential. Oh, the wife is sorting them out. No, I look like Hitler now. Don't do that. So I would, but also in a sense, the point of safeguarding, the point of having these boundaries and rules is that you don't put the leaders in that position where dark parts of their own sexuality that they're still working through become a thing, that they're not given that opportunity or not forced into the situation to do, because so often victims have become perpetrators. It's almost pointless trying to think of this as about we must blame these individual predators. The point of safeguarding is you could actually put children and potentially dangerous people together in the same situation, but if the rules are followed, the children are safe. If the rules are followed, the children are not going to be asked those things. If the rules are followed, those adults will not start to normalize asking intrusive questions and getting away with it and slipping into a voyeuristic sexuality, as you've described, Sam. And we need to understand it's not just asking kids about masturbation. There are countless stories of people who've had sex, as teenagers with someone, and then the leaders want every gruesome detail. And they were told to do that in training. You can find the talks by general authorities of the church telling them to be very specific. You can read Miracle of Forgiveness about how there, as a repentance process, these men are meant to meet with them regularly and carefully police every thought and action they do, which all sets them up to do that. Thank you. So
Sam,
I think that's why it's so important that if you have a good safeguarding policy and training, it immediately rules out, it prevents, it protects people, whatever the sharks circling in our community are. It significantly reduces their opportunity to become worse through habit and exposure and opportunity, and it significantly protects the children. And what you did was focus on the system, not blaming individuals, and that's the answer.
And we are coming back to safeguarding. Sam, you were gonna.
I wanted to ask one question, Peter, and that was very eloquent and right on point. Thank you. You'd mentioned that the new guidelines say the bishop should not ask intrusive questions.
Yeah.
Now, that might be new. The last time I saw it, it said the bishop should not ask overly intrusive questions.
Oh, yes. And also, there's a caveat which says it's hilarious, actually, that in a grim context, questions that will spark curiosity. And it never says curiosity about what. But the message
Yeah.
has got through to them that there's all these kids hearing about masturbation for the first time in their bishop's interview from the bishop.
Yeah.
And so that's clearly Mormon passive aggressive speak for don't tell them about how to masturbate because then they'll go and do it. And don't be the first they hear about this from. I mean, you're right. Sorry to call me up on that because the language is always intentionally vague with the church. They want plausible deniability. They still want to leave it to local leaders to interpret things however the hell they really feel like it, and as we see in practice. And that's a really good point to make. Actually pay close attention to the actual wording because it's never as strong as people think it is when you actually pay attention to it. And they've another thing. Sorry, that just again this incompetence situation. With this new policy, they issued a letter from the first presidency to parents, and they said that to bishops, this letter must be given to the families of 11-year-olds about to have their first worthiness interview. And in the letter, it kind of describes what's going to be asked. It's basically prepping them, so it's not a shock when they have the interview. It outlines some of these boundaries that they shouldn't be, but it says in the letter that the child is meant to see, do not ask questions that will spark curiosity. And like I teach secondary age children, I don't know a single 11-year-old who will not read that. And the next question is, oh, mummy and daddy, curiosity about what? I mean, the scale of hysterical, farcical incompetence that the whole policy is pointing towards don't mention masturbation and give them ideas, and yet the first presidency itself has insisted that a letter from them is read by the 11-year-old child mentioning don't tell the kid about the thing, and they give it to the kids. You cannot make this up. You cannot make up the scale of utter amateur shambolic incompetence. They have not talked to any safeguarding professionals. You watch their video and you watch them have a system that does that and that has filling the world with for the strength of youth, telling the kid to confess every sexual thought they ever had urgently to the bishop because it's a sin second only to murder. That's all still there from flipping 1985 when it was written. And the first presidency sends a letter that the kids are meant to read, referencing the thing you don't want the kids to ask about or be told. What does that tell you? It tells you that somehow not a single actual trained professional in this field has been anywhere near any of these policies. And if they tried, they were totally ignored. I mean, you can't make up how stupid, primarily, and dangerous this whole system is. It's astonishing. And why are we asking
Well,
kids
Peter,
these
I'll
questions
disagree with
anyway?
you on that one.
I mean,
When you
it's
say that,
farcical, isn't it? Yeah. It's not
yeah, when you
conspiracy,
say
it's
that you
just
can't make it up,
incompetence. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
You
I just want to say you're wrong. You can't make it up. They're making it up. They're pretty good at making this up. So we're just astonished that you can make it up.
In a country where they have watched the Roman Catholic Church be literally crucified for decades now for its negligent safeguarding procedures.
Yeah.
So
There's no
what I'm
excuse.
going to do is I'm going to specifically then talk about this situation before we come back and talk about safeguarding, because what you just mentioned, Peter, is actually really important. Okay, so I give lots of thought to the language that I use around this. we've mentioned this before in the podcast. A few months ago in Scotland, we saw a situation where a trial took place where a Mormon couple, a Latter-day Saint couple, were accused of historic childhood abuse. That trial was reported in local media. I would suggest it was very poorly reported. But what was reported was that the couple who were accused were exonerated, were found not guilty of most of the charges. One charge was not proven. That is a uniquely Scottish verdict where it basically gives no exoneration to the person who is accused and no satisfaction for the person who is making the accusations. So we had this situation, which is clearly very highly charged, which, the Mormon church in the UK is so small and built up of so many families. All we need to, in order to make sure that we're okay with our child having a sleepover, is to know that the family they're having a sleepover with, they're a Mormon family. They go to church, and that's sufficient. They go to youth together, they have camps together, and so we become wards who are very, very enmeshed. We have a very small pool of Mormons, which means we all end up marrying each other, going down to different stakes. So you're going to be related or one step away in many instances. So we all know and we all love the people who are both accused and the people who make these accusations. Now, a couple of months ago, when the Protect the Children page, which specializes in highlighting instances of abuse or allegations within the world of Mormonism, had shared the news report that was printed in the local paper, and it was a mess. The comments were a mess. The Protect the Children moderators were exceptional, as were you, Sam. So all of this, the actual page itself were wonderful, but in the comments, a storm most definitely erupted. Would you speak a little bit to what that was like for you watching that unfold?
Well, first of all, I thought it was great to have an open discussion about things. And you had two sides of the story. One was the victim side, one was the side of those that had been prosecuted and exonerated, except for the one part that you mentioned. So I thought it was a good discussion. It got a little bit heated, or a lot heated. And we were just gonna, Katie, who's the moderator of that space, was really good at. I thought there were a lot of people that just had a lot of good comments, and so I hope what I'm going to say next is well received. But you've got the victim side of the stories, and we want to believe them, and the vast majority are true. Very seldom do people falsify this stuff. But you also have the perpetrators, and some of the perpetrators, no, all the perpetrators are real people, and I don't want to say that there's compassion that can be had there too. But for me, in the process of all this, I've had perpetrators reach out about. I had a couple stories submitted to our LDS Children, and I didn't publicize. I didn't feel like those stories should be alongside victim stories, but they've got their own stories that are sad about what happened, that they realized they were wrong, that they're working through all that, their family and so on. if someone is accused falsely, well, that's their reputation and causes lots of problems. So I was kind of listening to both sides and thought, okay, the folks that are upset that were exonerated in court, well, they need to be listened to. Now, we were eventually received messages that threats from maybe a lawyer or a lawyer that if we didn't take down the page, they're going to sue us. And we decided not to respond to that. We ended up taking down that post for another reason, but it wasn't because somebody threatened to sue us. And I was just looking at the threat to sue us. But all we did was publish a news story, share a news story on here. So it doesn't seem like we should take the thing down. But they also talked about how this was hurting the parents, and they're good people and all that stuff, and which I get. And this was just harming. Anyway, I'm not even sure what I'm saying here, but all those issues came up on this post.
And it's really important just to make super clear that, especially, with the public forum that we're in, we are not suggesting that any verdicts were unsafe, unsound, or we're not in any way challenging them. We are talking about the broader issue of how the subject of abuse plays out in a uniquely Mormon way, and the ways in which it affects our broader Mormon and ex-Mormon communities. Peter.
Yeah, I just think, I'm really glad we've had this little conversation, because it does show how messy this is. It's awful. It's horrible. Who do you believe? There's trust issues. The whole thing is desperately entangled and awkward to know what best to do. And I think, in a sense, that is why people don't want to talk about it, because it can open all kinds of cans of worms. There are still lots of stories that have never been told, and people are still hiding them. We all have guilt about mistakes maybe we've made ourselves, and it's this whole spectrum of pain and difficulty. And I think, in a way, so for a start, kudos to you, Sam, that you stood up and decided to enter the fray on this, because it is one of the worst things to talk about. It's absolutely my least favorite subject ever to even think or talk about. I'm sure it is yours. I know, you've said it is. No one's here because we're enjoying sort of being the center of attention, talking about something dreadful. But unfortunately, the scale of harm that not having effective safeguarding in the church and not having a safe language to talk about sexuality with young people within the church still forces us to have these difficult conversations, forces us to enter the fray on these very tricky issues, which we know are painful and difficult and life impacting, because you can't not talk about it. If you have any kind of integrity or compassion for other humans, or care for the institution, the communities within the church, the exponential scale of harm that comes from not protecting children, from any one incident of abuse or harm, can just spiral. It can divide families, it can split congregations, it can create festering worry that goes on for years for everyone involved in any case. And this is just one of many as an example. And just the overwhelming weight of ethical responsibility must be on the church to do a professional job here, because everyone else is. Everyone else, all the other responsible churches are all over this and have been for years, as Sam has been pointing out all along. We don't have to be the worst in the world at dealing with this. No one needs to invent anything new. And the arrogance, as well as the incompetence of neglect and stupidity with the system they have in place now that I've described, but the arrogance of we can't learn anything from anyone else. We can't learn anything from Natasha Helfer Parker. We'll just excommunicate her. We can't learn anything from the professionals. We can't learn anything from the other churches because we're the best and we know everything, and our leader, is perfect. I mean, it's just all comes from that fundamental stupid arrogance and lack of humility, that pride of not being willing to learn.
But also, Peter, and I think because I'm kind of looking for both of you to maybe respond to this. what was the reason why we are doing this whole series in part not only is because this is what was so important for Alana, but also because the uniquely Mormon way this was playing out saw that actually silence was the only option. Silence was what was being asked for, not by the church, but by the actual membership of the church as a coping response. So we have people who, aren't speaking. And let me just make this really clear. I'm not talking about this specific case. People who were reading the comments and saying, I cannot now tell my story, or who were reaching out to us and saying, actually, this happened to me, or who even in the comments were saying, this happened to me, and this is what I am now going to do based on what you're saying. You are not being honest with yourself. So that was coming from victims and survivors. And then from the other side, we had a community who were specifically saying, you cannot talk about this. We know the people involved in whatever way, either in support of or the accused, or in support of the alleged victims. We saw such a polarization, and across the board it was, we do not talk about this. Now that is Mormonism in the UK. Across the board. The church, absolutely. The church behaved completely irresponsibly. To call a ward fast is beyond the pale. No, this is not the first time this has happened. This has happened in other areas, in other parts of the world. And I mean, it shouldn't need an explanation, right? We horrify ourselves every time we remind ourselves of this. But it was the silencing of victims. So where the alleged victims in this story, to be totally taken out of the equation in this, what was happening was people were contacting the Protect the Children page, and our friend Katie, who is giving up her time and volunteer work to moderate this page, is sitting in these stories day by day, is being told, you're not allowed to talk about this, is being silenced. You're not allowed to amplify the voice of, you should know more about this story, or this is crossing some kind of line. That's one person. And so this is what really fascinates me. It's not even necessarily about let's make sure our policies and things are super tight. It's about the fact that in the first place, we are coming right back to what Sam did back at the beginning and asked, is this happening to anyone else? And created this space for people just to move into, to share their stories. And he is still doing that today. And that's still at the root of all of these movements to protect children, to amplify, to protect children, to bring safeguarding policies more into line in the church with what they need to be. It is individual people's stories that are at the heart of that.
And so I think, and Sarah's commented in that it's about training and education. Everything you've talked about is how we don't have a language to talk about this. I mean, it's going to be a complicated thing to disentangle. We need to change some things. We need to stop masturbation being on the list of sins. One could argue, there's a whole conversation to have around that. There is, because everyone's going to do it. The harm for the church is catastrophic because most of our young people leave as soon as we start having these interviews with them. That's the age they drop out. Or if they persist, they very quickly learn to lie. Because if they're honest with their church leaders in the way they're being expected to, they get fed into a mincing machine of addiction recovery programs, of all kinds of humiliating public shame, especially if you're a young man, because everyone knows if you're not passing the sacrament, you must have been, you've had a nice wank this week and you foolishly told someone about it. And it's just ludicrous. And so that needs fixing. We need a positive way to frame sexuality that isn't just vague euphemisms, that is more specific and that everyone is encouraged to actually go for. As people have said in the comments, we need professionals to be involved in writing the church's training materials And rather than, again, oh, here's a random talk, literally by Boyd K. Packer, of all people, with an animation about a snake and some chicks in the nest, that will fix everything. And it involves some effort and triangulation and some change. And unfortunately, I think what we see in the church is they become so fossilized and paralyzed, they can't escape. They're at the cage of their own making. This is why they're so utterly dependent on lawyers now, that the bottom line for the church is whatever we have to do legally, we will do, and whatever we can get away with legally, we will do. And bishops, when you come across a case of abuse, your first hotline is to our lawyers. Before you talk to the police. That still seems to be the thing. They now give language about disclosing to authorities, but when you dig deep, it's only if it's mandated in that country. And the church fought and lobbied intensively against legislation in Utah to make clergy mandatory reporters. The church opposed that, and they won with their political power to ensure that clergy don't have to report abuse that's disclosed to them. So it's all a whole system involving Curtin McConkie, the church's lawyers. I mean, there was some Gina Colvin on Thoughtful Faith did an interview with a lawyer who's been involved in a lot of the cases where the church has tried to cover up abuse, and they've represented the families to pursue it. And immediately the church comes in with fortunes of money, makes intensive threats to basically bankrupt these people if they persist in the courts, and try and force them into a non-disclosure agreement and settle out of court. And the lawyer says, every time I even start engaging with members of the church who are about to go up against the church about its neglect or covering up abuse, they need to know by the end of it, they're probably going to have no testimony left, because they're about to see the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as a vicious, persecuting, lawyered up force that willing to do anything to silence them. And they do. They end up leaving the church because they see what's really going on here and what the systems are. So I think what Sam, we know we can't go on all night. What Sam has unleashed and helped us to do is, you walked into a lion's den, Sam. You walked into a really messy, complicated, difficult situation with a huge organization that was totally unwilling to change. And with your humor, with your positivity, with your persistence, even when it was hurting you inside, you just kept going with one simple, rational message of reason to a community of millions of people who mostly had not raised their voice to do that, or seen what was in front of their faces, or were just ignoring the women who are usually the only ones speaking up about it. And I can attest to that. My mum, as a Relief Society leader for many years, in the past, was on the fringes of dealing with all kinds of issues, trying to advocate for her sisters, and often not being supported in the ways they needed. And I just want to pay tribute to you, because it was done with style, with confidence, with your good humor, your personality that you brought to it. You inspired us all. You showed us this can be fun. Like, you can have flags and climb mountains, and you can take direct action. The Brit Avengers have been having a wild time with that philosophy ever since. Thank you. And there's much more to come out still that is still sort of playing through in various things that different people are up to. You trained a generation of activists. Honestly, you really did, for direct action in ways that nobody else has ever in our whole history, I would say.
Oh my gosh.
Maybe since the Nauvoo Expositor. And I just want you to always feel proud of that legacy, even if you don't do another thing. Retire with pride. I know you still care, and you've just given us nearly 3 hours of your time because you're so passionate about this, and we thank you. This is all going, in a sense, on the historical record as a resource for people to understand this issue better. I honestly, you're a hero in my household, and I know in thousands of others. We cannot thank you enough. You changed our lives. You changed the church, and not just on this one issue. You taught us that we can speak up and we can make a difference, and that when you are speaking truth to real issues, thousands of Latter-day Saints will rally around to support you. we can take back control of this religion from the people who are damaging it. And even with good intentions, they're doing incredible harm. And you've shown us we can have the power to take back our power and be powerful because we have the truth. And it's that simple if you just keep saying it and you don't get intimidated by them, whatever they try to do to you. And I was able to walk into my excommunication with a big fancy glowing hat on and feathers, and I had a blast because you showed us how to do that. You showed us how to make it fun, and you showed us how to speak our truth. And you, by sharing the pain of your excommunication, you helped me to have much less pain with mine because I knew what to expect and I was able to prepare for it and work around it in a sense. So I thank you personally for that as well. And each time, in a sense, people are going through this, they're more prepared and they know what's coming, and they're emotionally prepared as well because of your kindness and vulnerability in sharing your journey through it all. So that's just some of the things I'm very grateful to you personally for, and
Well,
really appreciate it.
Yeah, those are extremely kind words. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Now, you had said something earlier that plays into this. You had said, Sam, you're an ordinary guy, nothing extraordinary. And that is a huge thing I'd like to, because when you talk like this, it is, well, that's some guy that is Superman. And I'm not Superman. I'm a normal, ordinary guy. And that should give hope and validation and confidence to lots of people that, look, an ordinary guy did this. If you feel ordinary, you are in a perfect situation to make a difference.
Yeah.
Amen to that. Okay, we just had a comment asking about, conversations and how active members in church leadership could be listening. Wouldn't it be great if they were listening to these types of conversations? Guys, they are. Okay, we have so many, probably about half of our viewers are active. I'm active. This, from the get-go, Peter and Sam would say things that every now and again I would feel like I was going to have a nosebleed. Like, oh, you guys are so awesome, and you're getting so close to that line. I'm feeling a bit nauseous. You know what? There is space for this in this church, and that is what really excites me. The fact that we can feel really strongly and bring our feelings and not have to be complete emotionless robots in order to get someone to listen. You're allowed to have pain and anger and to know that something needs fixed, and we can handle it. So yeah, I hope we're modeling that, and I guess I would just encourage you to like and share and subscribe and all of those things. A couple of questions before we're moving towards wrapping up. But I wanted to ask, because I think this is super important, and it's also relating to that comment about members listening. Where is it working? Peter, you had mentioned your stake and how it has this excellent practice. Let's give him a shout out. Which Canterbury stake? No, what's
So this is Canterbury Stake,
Canterbury stake?
And I've spoken to my stake president, and he's said he's very happy to share their policy that they have with any other church leaders who reach out and request it. So that's an open invitation. He's not a person who wants to get sort of visibly leading some kind of revolution or anything politicized, as he puts it, which is completely reasonable.
Just tell them like the Brit Vengers sent you? What, like if you're
No,
gonna
don't mention that. But he's absolutely happy to share it. They've had the courage to do this themselves. No one broke the church. It all is fine. It's easy to do. All the provisions are easy to do in Britain. Local councils will provide free annual safeguarding training to voluntary organisations. The church is rolling in cash, so it can absolutely afford background checks if you end up having to pay for any of that. But I think, again, it's a cheap fee for voluntary organisations. You can do it, and but in parallel to Sam taking action, concerned members of my stake within the absolutely orthodox faithful hierarchy recognized the problem. they persisted, as Sam has, with raising this issue for years until finally, in the leadership roulette, a leader willing to actually bite the bullet and go for it and implement it and recognize that this was something we needed, did it. So I just want to give huge kudos to that it's not just sort of the vocal social media dissidents who are being the change. There are people who bring their secular career professionalism and training into their callings at church, and they're heroes because they often face a really tough struggle, just as we all have. And they're doing it on the inside. So again, that's a model for us all. And the church actually loves pilot programs that work. You can influence the church in a big way if you pioneer something locally and it works and you can sort of prove it's successful, then suddenly it's in the global training the next year. So take that opportunity, for people who want to do things better, try it. If it works, they love it. It's a free pilot program. The church runs its own pilot programs. It does a lot of market research of members' attitudes. So participate in those, fill in the surveys, give them feedback when they're asking for it.
Oh, the surveys. Yes,
Take it,
fill
make it
in the
happen.
surveys. Sam, where are you seeing things working? Have you had any feedback about, you mentioned California, that was the recent announcement that they're piloting safeguarding there?
Well, that's they're complying with the new law.
Okay.
There might be a piloting to comply with the new law that they'll roll out. I'm really
now it all
not that
makes
plugged in.
sense.
And frankly, I'm not that plugged into what is going on in the church today. I still pay attention, but not nearly as much as I did at one time. The 3 years that I was involved in Protect LDS Children, Protect Every Child, they were very costly on my business and my savings. And 2020, 3 months before the pandemic, it was okay. I've got to dedicate myself to building my career back up because retirement is looming really quickly. So anyway, I've spent most of I don't dedicate I was like 80% focused on the children cause for those 3 years. It's now maybe 5% of my time because I don't. Now I hope that'll change after retirement, but as a result, I'm not as plugged in on what exactly is happening.
So what is next for you, Sam? What can we do to support the work of Protect the Children while you are focusing your energy where it needs to go? What's next for you?
You're doing something wonderful by continuing to raise the awareness. This interview right here raises awareness. The interviews you've done prior to this continue to raise and spread awareness. I love that you have viewers that are in the church. Now, I didn't want to leave the church. I got kicked out, but I was an active member of the church until that day. 3 of my children are active in the church. I support that. I've gone to baptism, baby blessings, and so on since my excommunication. The church people do a lot of good things in the church. There are a lot of good things that can come out of the church. There are big dangers that need to change. But so being able to raise awareness with members of the church, that's wonderful. So members of the church, what happened in Peter's stake that he participated in, encourage that in your own stake. Establish your own gold standard, not your own gold. The gold standard is there. What has been already developed by communities and governments and organizations, advocate for that to protect your children. So there's some things.
So before we wrap up, there is Alana. I do this on behalf of Alana and you know what, Peter's here too. But so one of the things that we always feel it important to do, claiming our authority as women in the church, and Peter.
I'm quite camp. I'm halfway there.
Well, you have never, you know what? You need to have this opportunity too. But yeah, having a Mormon background and all of these gifts of the Spirit, one of the things that we started doing at the beginning of podcasting was to bless the journeys of those that we spoke to, because everybody's journey, whether it's taking you in the church, out of the church, around the houses, or wherever you go, everyone's journey is their own and is of value. And we have learned so much from your journey, Sam, so much. And thank you for taking us on your journey with you. And so on behalf of all of us Brit Vengers, but on behalf of, I guess mostly because Alana's not here to say these words herself, Sam, we bless you that you're work that you're doing in the build up to your retirement is as successful and enriching as it can possibly be. We bless the work that you have done and that you continue to do to protect the vulnerable and to amplify their voices. We bless you that your work will be received well, and we bless your heart that it will continue to be open and full of joy and friendliness and all of those good things that you've brought into your life. We bless that right back in your wonderful, wonderful face. We love you, Sam, so much, and we are so thankful for you.
Well, thank you. And thank you for all those blessings. Oh, man, you don't get blessings like that very often. Thank you, my friend. And I love you guys too very much.
Well, you are so dear to us. In closing, then, Peter, I'll go to you first, and then Sam, and we'll just let you guys say anything that you'd like to say to take us out tonight.
For once, I've said it all already. It's a miracle. It took 3 hours, obviously, but but absolutely, just great, huge thanks. And I know I'm representing a lot of other people for every aspect of what you've done, the individual example, the courage, showing us that we can be a voice and make change happen on any issue, not just this one, but also that we can tackle the most difficult one, the hardest one. And I just want to give a shout out to Patrick Kieran, who's our only British General Authority. He did a barnstorming talk in the last conference. I don't know if you've heard it, Sam, but you should go listen to it immediately. You will be delighted. Patrick Kieran. So he's one of the presidency of the 70. He's a Brit. He's the one who did the talk about the refugees before that was quite a hit. And he spoke directly to victims of abuse. He told them, and this was really significant because it was exactly on the 20th anniversary of Richard G. Scott's appalling talk where he basically blamed victims of abuse for being sinful. He very specifically undid all of that. He said all the right things. He spoke very powerfully. It is not to victims. It is not your fault. There is no excuse for this. It's totally unacceptable. Jesus loves you, sort of thing. So you'll love that. So the message, Sam, is getting through. It's getting through to a British General Authority who took it to General Conference.
Very cool. That's wonderful.
I'm sure that the whole awareness that you kicked off contributed significantly to that. So watch that and take pride.
Thanks for that recommendation.
Sam, have you got any closing thoughts for us?
Okay, so this, who knows, may or may not be appropriate, but at this very moment, I am feeling that life is wonderful. Being able to interact with people like you. I wish I could reach out to all the people that have commented, but right now I just want to say life is great. It's great to have great friends, and thanks very much for what you are doing. Thank you for your friendship, and to all those that might be victims or survivors that are out there, just know that you are loved, you're heard. If you can't tell your stories yet, that's okay. If you can never tell your stories, we know you're there. We know that things have happened in the past that are not good, but we stand behind you, we support you, and we love you. There you go.
Thank you so much, Sam. So as we wrap up tonight, I want to let you know that we're not just talking about this. We still have some episodes to cover. There are still some voices who are going to be speaking. some subjects that we are going to be talking about. But we're not just going to leave it there. We are working on making sure that if you're a member of the church, if you're a leader within the church and you need support with any of these things that we're talking about, if you need resources, we are here to help you. And we will be reaching out to you. But, you can get in touch with us if you need us. To the people who have experienced, or if you know someone who has experienced any of the subjects that we have spoken about tonight, you can reach out to us, but also we would ask that if you need support, there are so many organizations who are there and are ready to listen. If you need pointed to any of those, we can do that. We've got the wonderful Sarah who's taking care of that for us tonight in the comments. But in the days and weeks to come, as you process, we are here. We want to assure you that over the next few months, as things come to light in the UK, as more light continues to be shone on these issues, which we're aware that there are things, in the pipeline. If you need to talk about any of those issues, we are here. We want to make sure that if you do want to speak out, that you will be heard, your voice will be valued and listened to. We bless all of your journeys tonight. Next week, we are back with the podcast guest that a lot of you have been waiting for, the dear Drew Hunter, who is a friend to so many of you here in the UK. He will be with us here next week. And we thank you so much for the time that you have spent with us tonight. You can find out more about the work of Protect the Children here in the show notes. They're over on Facebook, all of those good things. So do go and find out how you can support their work by donating to their campaign. Thanks so much, everyone, and we will be back with you next week. Good night.